No,
That's
a different
oh,
one. That's the advantage or disadvantage of being the youngest.
yeah, true.
Pleasure. So, well, let's get rolling.
Okay.
Jonas has too much good stuff to share. I don't want to. I'm gonna spotlight Jonas for everybody, and I think everyone knows him. He's a phenomenal teacher, bonsai artist, and disappears quickly.
Gone. Gone.
He's got a wonderful blog, Bonsai Tonight, as well. So it's very informative, and he's going to educate us regarding the creation of Deadwood.
Don't forget his book.
And yeah, I don't have his book here. I know others do. His book is fabulous.
Yes.
But I didn't bring it with me to Oklahoma. So
That's
without
probably
further
fine.
ado, sorry, Jonas, I like it, but so
Gotta keep
I
the
have-
luggage light.
The book right here.
yeah, well, we'll share that at the
Awesome.
end. How about that? So
Beautiful.
I don't know if you can see my screen.
here, I'll spot.
Find in the shelf over there.
Can you see the book, Dodie?
I did, and I was trying to spotlight. you.
Okay.
Well,
I
thank you,
can
Dodie.
add spotlight so you're split. Maybe. Did I do it? I don't think I did.
No,
Oh, well.
that's all right. Okay.
I'm going to replace you for a second. Okay, Kathleen.
Okay.
There you go. The Little Book of Bonsai. Wonderful pictures, wonderful information.
And contour and overflow. And this is where we can see the environment.
And it
This is where
sounds
Ryan
like
Neal's
we
here
have-
tonight. I know that voice.
and I'm in a ultimately arid, kind of odd creeping form that also
There we go. Somebody's audio was taken away. So Jonas, educate us on creating Deadwood, and maybe a lot of us might mute ourselves, and you can unmute yourself to ask a question.
Thanks. That sounds great. Hi, I'm Jonas. It's very good to see you all. Based on this being a pretty reasonable sized group, feel free to interrupt at any point at all tonight with a question, either by, as Dodie mentioned, unmuting yourself, or if someone's going to watch the chat, feel free to text in a question if you don't want to speak in front of the whole group, and whoever can just interrupt me at any old point in time with the questions. As Dodie mentioned, we're going to talk about the absolute basics of creating Deadwood with hand tools today. And we're going to look a little bit at Deadwood design, at creating Jin, which are dead branches on trees, and at creating Shari, which are dead areas along the trunk. And I don't know if there are many beginners who have joined, but it probably sounds fun to focus on so much death in bonsai. But for some species like junipers, one of the most prized characteristics we look for in junipers, or that we try to develop when we're creating the trees from scratch, are these what are known as Deadwood features, the Jin and the Shari, because it kind of tells the story, or helps us tell the story, of the hardships a tree might experience in nature up in the mountains. And a number of you I know have trees that were collected from the mountains. The Sierra Nevada in California is covered with all kinds of wonderful junipers growing up at 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet. And those trees have a very short growing season and a very harsh, windy, rocky environment. And so that just leads to naturally a lot of deadwood. And so what I want to do tonight is show you some pictures of some deadwood that we can kind of use as a starting point for what it is we're talking about. And then we'll look at I will live work on a tree or two, and we'll go through the basic tools you use and the techniques for making the basic Jin and Shari. But before I do any of that, I want to ask, what is it that you all most want to know about making Deadwood features? Or is it easy and you're just doing this because it's a fun program?
I don't know how to do it. We have several trees, like I don't know what you call it, where it's cut off the top.
Mhm.
So how do you make that look nicer? So how to do it without screwing it up.
Okay, that sounds like everything we do in bonsai. How do you wire a tree without screwing it up? How do you prune it without screwing it up? How do you fertilize it without screwing it up? Very good question. What other questions? And what do we want to know when we are looking to create Deadwood features?
I have a question as to how young a tree you can do that to.
Really young. If you're starting a juniper, I'd recommend it within, doesn't need to be the first year of the tree's life, but after 3, 4, 5 years, somewhere in that neighborhood, if you're looking at doing a long-term project, that's when I would start doing the Deadwood. And if you're curious for more details, I can talk about why that is. And actually the trees we'll be looking at will be a perfect example of why it's important to start early instead of waiting until the end, which is what most growers traditionally do around here.
And I'm curious about, is it lime sulfur that you use to whiten the gin and shari?
Yeah, there's a number of different things we can apply to the Deadwood, and lime sulfur is a really common one, and that's the one that I most commonly use in the garden. Wood hardeners, which may or may not have pigment, and or some people use different kinds of paints or other products, are the other options. But I tend to let the wood dry out a long time after, and we'll go over this later, but I tend to let the wood dry out, apply lime sulfur, and you can either color it with ink or water it down, or simply wait a certain amount of time to pass so the bright color dulls over time. But again, we can get into those details along the way.
Then you have,
Whoops. I might have muted. Mark, was that you? Unmute yourself if I.
I'm
did
here.
that.
I didn't say anything. I'm here.
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
And so Dodie touched at some of what we're looking for when we're creating the Deadwood, in that I have this thing that was cut off my tree and I want to make it look better. How do we do that without messing anything up? And by messing it up, that would be possibly cutting off more than we want, or leaving tool marks on the tree, or making it look unnatural. And so that's really what we're going to focus on today, is how do you create Deadwood features that make them look natural? What is it that characterizes a natural look, and how can we try as best we can to affect that when we're working on our trees? And a little bit about the design, about where that Deadwood goes, and how the Deadwood we create is often one of the most important choices we make in terms of making the tree look artificial, or making it look like something that might have developed in nature. And so we'll go over that a little bit. And so unless you have any other questions right away to get started, I want to show a few pictures of just some natural Deadwood growing up in the mountains, and then a few wildly different examples of what Deadwood can look like on trees that I've seen in exhibits.
One question that maybe you can answer later, Steve was wanting to know how to create the ribbon look.
Oh, that's totally straightforward, and we will definitely cover that.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
We often get that, Deadwood's only reserved for, evergreens and conifers. How do you feel about having them on deciduous trees?
So you can put Deadwood on any tree, and the way I think of it is you can tell whatever story you want through your trees, and usually all I ask for is that the story makes sense, or at least has internal logic. And so we can all think of a story why there might be Deadwood on a deciduous tree. I tend to not feature a lot of Deadwood in my deciduous designs because in nature, depending on the species, we're a lot less likely to see Deadwood than we are on species like junipers. But then that said, I don't limit it to conifers because I don't see a lot of Deadwood on black pines when I see them in nature. And so I tend to not do Deadwood on pines. Now, if ever I have a tree in my collection or one that I'm working on that has Deadwood already, then the goal becomes, how do we make it look as attractive as possible? How do we kind of come up with a story for that tree that can account for why we have Deadwood, and then pretty much try to style or design the Deadwood to kind of bring out the best that the tree has to offer to tell a compelling story. Does that make sense?
Yes, I often get deciduous trees that already have some deadwood on them, or the main trunk is died off, and so I do try to incorporate that into the tree since it's already there. If it doesn't work, then I just cut it off.
Exactly. And it's a lot easier to take things away from a tree than to put them on. So that's a perfectly fine way to do it. So can you all see the screen I'm sharing?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, bonus points to anyone who knows what species this is.
Bristlecone.
Yes. How did you know that so fast?
Bristlecone pine.
How did you recognize it as
Been
bristlecone?
up there.
Yeah.
So tell us specifically, for those who haven't been there, what separates this from a piece of driftwood you might find on the beach, or what distinguishes it?
The ribbon line through the wood.
Junipers can have ribbons.
Mhm.
Well, just the aged look of it.
Yeah,
The
it's thick,
size,
thick
the
wood.
age.
Mhm. Yeah, the age.
Which is funny
probably.
because junipers can be big and junipers can be old. And so the reason I'm kind of pushing on this is, well, this is a bristlecone. When we're designing deadwood, there's a lot of things we can do that can suggest things as specific as species. I mean, this is purposefully a very abstract picture. It's hard to tell which way's up, which way's down, but we can see there is a lot of age. We can see there is a lot of character. And for those who've seen the bristlecone pines, or at least are familiar with the photos, it's pretty easy to make this a first guess that this would be a bristlecone pine. Let's see some other pictures from, the same tree. Here we are zoomed out a little bit. And again, this is very characteristic bristlecone pine deadwood. And so when we're carving, we're not trying to make all of the deadwood features look the same on all of our trees. And there are definitely some bonsai artists, some of them very well known, who do the exact same kind of carving on every single tree they work on. And when you see the carving, you don't think, oh, bristlecone, you think, oh, so-and-so did that. And so it's something to keep in mind when you're working on your trees is, are you looking for straighter lines or curvier lines? And just in this one photo, I know you can see straight grain kind of in the bottom right. You can see very gentle spirals along the left. And then you can see those really fascinating and honestly much more juniper-like twists in that middle area there. For those of you who haven't been to the bristlecones, if you're not afraid of long car drives, I highly recommend it. It might be maybe 5 hours from Sacramento, something like that. And there are 2 hiking trails there. One of them is very, very short. It's probably not 20 minutes round trip. And you can see the tree that we are looking at here. And it's just absolutely fantastic and definitely worth seeing if you ever are if you want to head toward the eastern Sierra Nevada. What about this tree right here? Any guesses as to the species?
The juniper? Sarah
No,
juniper?
I think this is actually also bristlecone.
That's what I thought. There's something about the patina on it with the stripes.
Yeah, when you see that fresh wind blown, it almost looks sandblasted. That's really evocative of that bristlecone. Whereas I think a lot of the junipers we see, especially the Sierra junipers, I think they turn that white color much, much faster. And even though the texture can be the same, you're less likely to see that tan wood color that you see. But you also notice that the character is completely different here than it was in the previous photo. This is, only 2-3 feet off the ground. It's a dead tree just growing right alongside the trail. And it just gives you a very, very different feeling. But it has the one magical characteristic that all really well executed bonsai have, and that is there are no tool marks. And that's our kind of number one enemy when we're working on these trees, or tool marks. So here is a faraway shot of that very first tree that we saw. We were looking at kind of a zoomed in portion. And this is one of the 2 famous dead bristlecone pines. This tree, I forget how many years it lived, if it was 4, 5, 6, 7. Maybe this lived 4,000 or 5,000 years, but it died a number of hundreds, if not 1,000 years ago. I forget the dates now, I should look it up. But this is a great example of the kinds of forces we can find nature having on the deadwood we're making. And we can see that the deadwood appeared at different times, in that you've got ribbons of wood growing around other pieces of wood, which is a sign that some branches died off while another part of the same branch kept living. For those who haven't seen this, this may be 12, 15 feet tall, somewhere in that neighborhood. So large, but not gargantuan. What about this tree? Any guesses as to what kind of deadwood this might be?
Sierra juniper?
Yep, Sierra juniper. And I will say it could be a whole lot of different species. And there's nothing that's particularly very Sierra about it, but it is very evocative of a branch that broke away a long time ago and has been eroded over the years to where we have these really, really fine points. And this is one of the best examples I have of when you hear people say that nature is the best creator of deadwood, this is the kind of thing they mean. I have yet to find anyone who's been able to come up with a technique for creating deadwood that looks like this. Those fine little splintery points are near impossible to create with tools and or techniques. We can get little bits of it, we can try breaking things away, and we can definitely evoke aspects of this characteristic, but to have a big field of delicate pokey things with perfectly naturally aged color variations on every little bit of it, this is really, really great. And so the reason I wanted to mention this is that when we have deadwood on our trees, say we're working with a tree that's been collected from the mountains, we want to go way out of our way to preserve as much character as possible in the deadwood. And if I had a piece of deadwood like this on a corner of a tree that had a little reverse taper, I would not even consider carving this away to get rid of the reverse taper because it's so important to convey the age and character that this wood provides. And so this is the kind of thing that I'm going to look to protect, and this is what I want to look to create. I can also point out that while we have the spiky stuff in the middle, off on that right-hand side, that wonderfully cracking wood that looks like when you pull a half-burned log out of a fire, that's another very, very hard look to achieve artificially. People have done things like alternating liquid nitrogen with a blowtorch to try to both dry out and erode away the pithier parts of the wood. And you can develop aspects of that. It's all in the grain, but that's what makes it special, and that's what makes it look natural. Is no sign of tools. If this were in a bonsai, you would just not have an obvious guess as to how someone made something that looks like that. Here is an example of a dead Sierra juniper with some lichen growing on it. And again, you can get the undulating forms, the different colors of wood based on how long ago it was exposed to the elements. And it actually is natural to have lichen growing directly on the deadwood. We tend to not see that much in bonsai. We don't favor that. We like seeing the wood. We also don't want the organic material to rot the wood by preserving more moisture next to it. And so you don't see that as much in bonsai, but it is a neat characteristic. Something else you'll notice is kind of a zebra-like color pattern on there. Some of the areas are bleached fairly white and the darkness is provided by shadows, but in other areas you can see that there is either a different kind of decomposition or even a fungus which can grow up on the deadwood in the Sierra Nevada. And that's what gives you that nice dark contrast. I've not seen this successfully done down at lower elevations, but it is yet another example of the kind of character we can find when we're looking at our deadwood trees up in the mountains. And here's a tree that's only about, not that far from the dead one we just saw. It's just kind of down below the hill. And it's an enormous natural semi-cascade bonsai. And I would just love to know how old this thing is. It's really old. I think that's a normal sized person right there. His name is Yoichi, and he runs helps his father run a bonsai nursery in Kanama, Japan. He grows satsuki and succulents, the least obvious combination you could think of. And so what do you all think of this tree? Does it look natural? Does it look unnatural? Are there appealing qualities? Are there off-putting qualities or characteristics?
I don't know how you could ever have a tree in nature look unnatural.
I think it's quite attractive.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's almost 6 or 8 feet across at the very base. It is an enormously broad tree.
I would think that the greenery, the branches near the guy to his right, was because of snow, because doesn't seem like that would be alive normally.
That's right. I would guess this is, it's very, very windy. So I don't know if much snow can build up right there, but in general in this area, this is at Carson Pass along Highway 88. It's actually about 100 yards before you get to the Carson Pass Ranger Station. On the other side of the street, there's a parking lot, and it's called Meese Meadow. And it's just a short hike up the hill from the Meese Meadow trailhead there. But we're at about a little over 8,000 feet, and it's incredibly, incredibly windy. And so I don't know how much snow buildup there is, but in general, where the snow collects, there can easily be 3 to 6 feet of snow all winter long right there. So it could be that lowest branch is completely buried for a full quarter of the year. Can any of you guess which way the wind is going? And so I think it's really safe to say this is a wind-influenced design, and that all of the wind that has to go over the Sierra Nevada has to get squeezed at the lowest point between the mountains. And Carson Pass is one of those points. And so this is where an incredible amount of the air that passes Sacramento will flow through the Sierra Nevada. As such, you might notice where the live and deadwood happen to be on that tree. You notice how at the kind of base of the trunk, all of the lifelines are protected from the wind, and all of the windward or west-facing parts of the tree have all died back. And so that's another thing to keep in mind when you're designing your trees, is that if you're going to make kind of a ribbony look, you might want to think, am I going to put the ribbon where it would receive the brunt of the elemental forces, or am I going to put the live wood where it's more sheltered? And there's kind of two parts to that, because you also have to ask yourself, if I put the live wood in a certain place, will it enhance the design or detract from the design? And so studying just how beautiful trees grow in nature can be a really great way to start thinking about the trees, which when we go to a bonsai exhibit are just way, way less compelling. And the reason I chose this tree, this was on display at the Kokufu exhibit a number of years ago, which is the top bonsai show in Japan, held every February. And I believe this is a black pine. There's a chance it's a red pine. I actually forget which it is. You typically see more deadwood on red pine, so maybe it's red, but the foliage looks green. Whatever, it's a really interesting example of the kind of deadwood you can see on pines. We have an unusually meandering gin near the bottom of the trunk, and then we have these large oval or kidney-shaped patches of deadwood all along the trunk. And to get a better idea of what those patches look like, you can see here yet another example of what I was talking about with that really interesting fissures in the deadwood, which is just incredibly hard to create. And that's the highlight of this tree, is the deep plates of bark. The incredibly flaky bark shows age. The deadwood shows the struggle in the tree's natural environment. And it shows that these patches have been dead for a very long time, because it takes a long time for the wood to decompose to where you're seeing those fissures or those little cracks opening up. It almost looks like a raku glaze that you might see on a pot. You can also see some of the gin, whether the one right in the middle or maybe over off to the side here, they're stubbed off square. And it's actually often in pine bonsai that the gin don't come to points. They're kind of squared off because the wood can naturally break that way. And this is kind of a fun example of that. Here is a deciduous species best known for having deadwood, and that's ume, or flowering apricot. This was from the same Kokufu exhibit, and it's an absolutely fascinating tree. It looks like actually a bunch of kind of a rotten crown and or roots, which they planted at a funny angle and then turned a couple buds into a bonsai, leaving the rest as this fascinating abstract sculptural element. What comes to mind when you see deadwood in a shape like this? It's so abstract. It's really hard to see anything. This doesn't really fit in what we think of when we think of our meandering juniper trunks. It doesn't really suggest the shape of the tree. We can't even tell what part of the tree this was. If you look closely at individual sections, you might see flames, you might see animals, you might see faces, you might see who knows what, depending on how recently you've eaten and or what you had to eat. And so it's just a really neat example of the creator of this piece had an opportunity to show off this absolutely fascinating abstract piece of work and kind of designed a bonsai around that. And so I think this is a good example of really, really dramatic forms you can create with deciduous species.
Wow.
And this is our Shimpaku, likely Itoigawa Shimpaku juniper. And this is the characteristics we're most likely to recognize in juniper bonsai. Sinuous, twisting movement, very thin lifelines, ribbons of deadwood capped with a little lifeline along the end. And, you know, this tree could easily be 200-300 years old. It could be a lot younger, it could be older, but it would not be crazy to think it's that old. And you'll notice that there's nothing straight anywhere at this angle. I actually took the picture from the side because I thought the curves were more spectacular when viewed kind of from an angle than viewed straight on. Design-wise, as a bonsai, it made sense to have the front it did, but I just loved how it's kind of hard to tell what's coming and what's going. Like, do any of you have an idea where that big loop on the right side, whether it's kind of coming or going? It's hard to tell whether it's going up or going down or just kind of spinning in a circle. And I don't remember how it was built, so I'd have to look pretty closely to see if I have other photos of the tree to figure out which way it's actually growing, whether up or down at that point.
Was Jonas, was all of
Yeah.
that man-made, or was was that natural, or a little bit
So
of?
what do you think?
It seems too perfect to be natural.
Yeah, nature can either be too perfect or just right perfect. It's hard to say. And so when I see kind of broken areas, like right below the white tag in the background, that looks pretty natural because I know that's a hard effect to carve. But right down at the base coming up from the trunk, well, that could be natural. That has much more of a carved look at the base of the trunk. The polished areas, there's a chance they're natural, but it does look like it's been carved. I just don't know why someone would want to remove character from that section, whereas the very top, you have these kind of nice striations that follow the grain, and it's been made very, very smooth there. So either someone did very good work a long time ago, or it has just been light modification in nature. I don't know one way or the other. I'd have to find out who, someone that knows this tree and get a better answer from them.
Jonas, your reply reminded me of something. At one point, there were some people who were doing sandblasting, and that was making it pretty smooth looking, as I recalled. So then I assume that they're trying to make the tree look more abstract rather than natural. Is that?
That's right. And we'll have a
Okay.
picture of, I have that 2 or 3 photos away, we'll see a picture of sandblasted deadwood. So you'll be able to see what that looks like. And it's true that initially the wood can look very different depending on the tools that are used, whether it's the dramatic chainsaw for the demo, whether it's hand tools, whether it is sandblasters. And there are these really teeny tiny bead blasters or sandblasters that people are using now to get this really wonderful natural look to it. Of course, if it's overdone, you can recognize it's been sandblasted, but in all cases, when the deadwood's been crafted by a person, it takes time before it starts looking its best. And so you carve the tree and then wait 15, 20 years, and then it looks good if you've done a good job. Now, what's funny is I believe this is also primarily natural deadwood, but it's a really weird shape. It's kind of a really unusual form. And if I recall, I just put this in here just to suggest that we've all seen beautiful trees. I wanted to show kind of some funky trees just to say that you don't really have to follow any rhyme or reason when you're doing a Deadwood forward design. You can just kind of pick the best front and the most interesting planting angle, a craft and apex or a silhouette around that, and just let the visitors decide if they like it. Does anyone strongly like or dislike this one?
I love it.
Well, I'll see if I can bring one back for you sometime that looks like this. Let's see, I think I have another one that looks totally different here. Yeah, I like this one. Another Shimpaku, and you see the character at the base of the trunk is completely different. But one thing I wanted to show about this tree is you notice how when you're designing a Deadwood tree, notice how if you just drew a line right across the middle of the screen, I guess I could do that. And if you, let's get a big old line right here. And so if I were just to draw a big line right across the middle here, notice how all the foliage is on one side and all the other good Deadwood is on the other side. Try when you're making bonsai, if this is okay, try seeing, can you think of a design where you can incorporate the foliage and the Deadwood together? Maybe some people like separating it, that's fine, but I know I always like it when the foliage brings out the best in the Deadwood rather than seems like it's totally different. If I air layered this tree and kept the top half, it would be completely unremarkable, whereas the bottom of the tree is absolutely fantastic. And so I want a design that really plays up this bottom part of the tree because that's the interesting part. But let me get back to that there. And here's a close-up of the bottom. And notice again, completely different characteristics than what we've been looking at in the junipers. A lot of the lines are horizontal and very straight, but they're varying in size, they're varying in thickness, and they're varying in height. And so even when all of your elements are straight, as long as you have variation among those straight elements, and by straight elements, I mean these kind of things here. We have a perfectly straight line right here. That grain is straight, this grain is straight, that piece of Deadwood is straight, as is this. And they're all parallel with each other. But because everything else is twisty, you know, we've got these kind of wonderful sloped gins on the side, we've got a beautiful curve along the side. There's enough variation here that we forgive that we have all of these not only straight but horizontal lines, which are usually the absolute biggest no-no. And so when we have the right character, we can get away with a whole lot of stuff. So I just mostly wanted to say that we have a lot of options for what we can do when we are making our Deadwood. Okay, almost done here. Here's your twisting, and the tree I work on tonight, we'll be able to talk a little bit more about the twisting, but for juniper specifically, it's not just Deadwood, it's not just movement we look for, but it's twisting movement. And that is a result of really a convention that arose based on how a very specific species, this Juniperus chinensis, started growing in Japan. And as we have developed a taste for that, we now design many of our junipers to evoke that same feeling. And even when we look for trees like Sierra juniper or California juniper, which do not twist very often, we really prize them when they do, which is funny because it's really just reminding us of the characteristics we appreciate so much about these junipers. And same question with this one. Anyone really strongly like or dislike this one?
I like it, but I'm not excited.
And why do you think that might be?
It's quiet, it's easy, it's not stark at all.
And by stark or easy, are you referring to the foliage or the trunk line?
The design.
And so that's another reason I wanted to show this. If I covered up the entire Deadwood and just painted that silhouette for you and asked you to guess what the shape of the trunk would be, you would guess it'd be a much heavier trunk and you would guess it'd be a much more conventional trunk because the foliage pads are designed in a way that make it look like a fairly conventional bonsai. But what's really going on is we have this fascinating movement with wonderful twists throughout and a pretty conventional bunch of foliage on it. And so I don't know what design I would want to do or what the angle would be, but I would definitely have more deadwood showing, less foliage showing. And I would try to incorporate that foliage with the deadwood in a way that lets us really, or encourages us to follow the line of the trunk without being distracted by the fact it looks like a lot of other trees. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a spectacular tree, but I think this is abstract enough of a trunk that there are many, many different kind of design options we could take with it. Oh, and here,
also
Kathleen,
because
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, it doesn't have the massiveness that some of the other trees have. And so with those slender trunk that's pretty much the same diameter all the way across, it has more of a feminine quality, I feel.
That's true. And with such a feminine design, one way to think of it, and this is really a fun exercise, and it actually works great that we have it digitally here, is I have actually traced the designs of the trunks and silhouettes of trees in exhibit books, whether the US National exhibit or something like a Kokofu book, or if you just find a picture of a tree you like online. And you can start asking questions like, if the trunk goes up, spins around, dives down, loops all the way over, and then kind of goes up, back and forth and back again, how is it that the silhouette has been created with an almost perfectly straight line? You could almost hold a ruler up to this. And so, and same thing with on the far side, how is it that we reconcile absolutely perfectly straight lines with this crazy curve? I will say it's a kind of a stylistic convention, and I've seen a lot of trees done like this, but it's the kind of thing we get to ask ourselves is, would we maybe want some kind of negative space that kind of lets us see into the tree where we have, not these big solid blocks, but some breaks somewhere? Would it be nice to know what happens somewhere up at the top of the tree? And might it be nice if we had some foliage in other places, maybe a much more compact silhouette, where if there was some green somewhere, just like poking out from behind it, that would make the tree look a little bit 3D, maybe just kind of a few back branches that poke through. These little hints might give us a whole different feeling. And then if you shrunk the whole tree down, it would make it a much less massive feeling. You've mentioned that it's a fairly masculine tree, or masculine styling on a feminine trunk, and that's true. And it might be that simply, even if you kept the exact same design in a much smaller frame, it would put a lot more attention on the deadwood. And so maybe we have a silhouette that's somewhere in that area with some big blocks of foliage. Sorry, I'm just coloring. I'm just kind of having fun with it, so you can kind of tell. But hopefully you get the idea that you can start to do things that don't, you don't have to follow exactly what you see. Think of it as a kind of a jumping off point. And I'm glad you're recording this, because I will use this as an example to tease myself here.
One other question, Jonas.
Yeah.
Was that form achieved when the tree was much younger?
I bet it was. One thing that we see a lot in Japanese exhibits are trees that were styled a long time ago, and the owner and or professional caring for the tree preserved that design year after year after year without making big modifications. And based on the maturity of these foliage pads, that's, I think, a really good guess as to what happened here.
So as beginners, how do we try to reach that kind of design? Young trees.
Well, so for the design work, apart from the deadwood work, but for the foliage work, honestly, that's practice and just your basic inspiration. The more time you spend looking at trees in nature, the more time you spend looking at beautiful trees, the more when you go to a show. What I do when I go to a show is I actually get really close up to the trees, and I look up into the inside and I say, what's actually going on up there in the apex? Where does this branch come from? What's going on in there? And I look, how are these trees built? And I'm never holding still. I'm getting close, I'm getting far away, I'm looking behind the tree, I'm looking up underneath it. And I'm trying to just understand, how are these trees built? How are they put together? And I think the more practice you have doing that, the more you're going to be able to develop your artistic vision, and you start playing around with that. I also think that when you grow trees from scratch and you work with younger material, you're faced with such different design decisions. Because when you go to a bonsai sale and buy a tree, bring it home and wire it, you're pretty much inheriting a trunk that'll require little, if any, modification. And you can put the branch here or there. That's kind of all you can do. But if you're growing some young juniper whips from scratch, or even an azalea whip or a young oak, you decide what line that trunk is going to follow. And maybe you're going to do something crazy like this. And I think working at those different stages of development is a fantastic way to kind of come up with some fun design secret powers you can use to show off to your friends. Here is what recently sandblasted Deadwood looks like on a juniper. And what's so awesome about it is when done well, you really don't see tool marks. Once in a while, you can see what look like some decisions that the artist made. For instance, one spot that looks like you can kind of tell where some tooling was might be this area right around here. But in general, this is a more or less smooth line along this curve. These curves are very smooth. And they did a really nice job preserving the detail. So I say they. The person who did the Deadwood work here is the person who actually built the tools that Kimura used to do his carving, and he actually did a lot of the carving on a number of Kimura's most famous trees. Takeo Kawabe is his name, and his garden's not too far from Kimura's in Japan. And he does some of the absolute best Deadwood carving of anyone I've ever seen. It's fantastic work. And that's what happens when you take an automotive engineer, switch him over to a career in bonsai, and then see what he does. He starts inventing tools and dreaming up stuff like this. I think he used to work for Nissan or someone before he started apprenticing with Kimura. So any questions about any of these images? That's all I'd wanted to share with you all. But before I get rid of that, any last questions about the images?
The bottom there in the center looks like he didn't quite finish, where it's rather straight and chunky.
Oh, down kind of at the bottom middle right there. I think it's actually doing a curve, but that we can't see it down there. And if I recall, it's a funny merger where the Deadwood actually comes down, goes toward us, goes back up, all in the same line. And between being out of focus and lined up, it looks kind of silly. But if I recall, he'd finished the Deadwood work on that branch. So the fact that it's out of focus and off to the side makes it look, and poorly lit, makes it look kind of weird. That's my guess. All right. Yeah.
Of the rest of the tree?
I do, but not right here. And so maybe that's a perfect plug for if you search for Bonsai Tonight Kawabe, Kawabe, you will very likely find a picture of this entire tree. These trees were jammed into a greenhouse in winter, and so some of them I didn't get good front photos of them, but if not this exact tree, I know I've got a photo of a full beautiful tree that had just been carved on that trip. And if you look really closely on the you'll see he's got it's a picture of his tool shed, and you can see some fun stuff on the wall in the picture. It's kind of a cool place.
Thank you.
Sure thing. All right, so where does that leave us if you have a tree that looks like this and you want to figure out how to do the Deadwood work on it? This is a far cry. This is spectacular material. It's a field-grown juniper from Bonsai Northwest, grown by John Muth up in Vashon Island outside of Seattle. And it's a far, far cry from all of the trees we just looked at, both in the mountains and in bonsai exhibits. And I bought a baker's dozen of these a number of years ago. Some I started doing the Deadwood work. This one, some of the pruning has been done and it's been repotted, but mostly it's grown for the last 4 or 5 years since I brought it home, and I've not done any work to it. It's just been waiting for a demo just like this. And so what I want to kind of go through are what comes to mind when I'm doing the design, and then kind of specifically the techniques and tools we use for creating Jin and Shari. So as we get started, what are some things that come to mind about what I might want to think about when I designed the deadwood for this tree.
Well, where's the front?
Where's the front? Good question. So when I was off camera before we started tonight, that's what I was doing, is looking for possible fronts. And I was kind of homing in on something maybe around
Yeah.
here for a front,
I like,
maybe a little bit more over, but yeah, somewhere in that neighborhood probably. So why not this front right here? Because the trunk kind of goes fairly straight right here, and it's not very interesting. Whereas, and the reason I didn't want a front back this way is the trunk's, not only is it more or less following a straight wobbly, but ultimately straight line, but it's going away from us. I know you can't see that, but you can see from the side that the tree actually does have a bit of a slant off into that direction. And so when I see a big slant, in general, I want to take advantage of one side of that slant or the opposite. And the reason this isn't the front right here is it could be a good front, but again, notice how very straight this line is right here. I'm realizing how hard it is to move my hand while looking at an image of it. But yeah, you can see this kind of line is pretty straight along here. And so what's fun is if we move it just a little bit or swing it around to the other side, what we're doing is we're trying to balance how do we get the most zigs and zags along the trunk, as well as show off or take advantage of some of the curves while having the top of the tree come towards us. Now, how many of you have designed deadwood before, and how many of you have tricks that you can share with us about how it's done? Easy, right? All right, cool. Is that clear?
yes.
Oh, and we'll get some more light on there.
When did you cut off the stubs, the stubs that are left?
I bet those were cut off at different times. Some of them probably were cut off when the tree was dug. These for sure were up, the ones up on the top. I know you can't see that. These up here were cut off when the tree was dug. And probably at various points in time, I cut off these lower ones. Now, any ideas why, and this is what I could have pointed out in the slideshow, any ideas why why I killed off all the branches on the bottom half of the tree? Look up a show book or some pictures of famous junipers online. And what you'll notice is, in general, there are very rarely any branches on the bottom half of the trunk. On conifers, the branches typically angle downwards. And when you have a big, heavy branch really low on the trunk, it kind of can't go down from there, can it? It goes up. And that's just outside of our conventions of how we typically style conifers. And so if the branches are coming down at a fairly steep angle, you could have your first branch all the way, I have to zoom out a little bit, all the way up here. And by the time it comes down, it might be at a reasonable height for a branch. And so without even thinking, I typically remove everything on the bottom third of the trunk, unless for some reason I need to preserve it. But in general, you just don't need load branches on juniper. I think the last pruning that happened on this, I think it was pruned when it was repotted a couple years ago, and it was pruned a couple months ago when we were taking some cuttings from it. Now, one of the questions came up from Dodie ahead of time is, what's the best time of year to do deadwood work? Now is probably the best time of year. Can you do deadwood work any day of the year? Definitely. What's so cool about doing deadwood work is it's not seasonally dependent. And so we often do a lot of deadwood work in summer and in spring before the big deciduous work kicks in, because when the sap is flowing very quickly through the tree, the deadwood separates easily from the trunk, and that's now. But if you don't do the deadwood work now, no need to fret. You can do it pretty much any day of the year. Now, in terms of the design, I know a lot of you, and I need to find some examples without offending someone. A lot of deadwood designs, people say, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to carve some deadwood. And they grab a strip of bark and they pull that strip of bark. And wherever it goes, that's where the deadwood is. Well, if the designer of the tree didn't create twists in the trunk, you're going to see a stripe all the way up that same side. And it'll reinforce the fact that there's no twisting anywhere on this deadwood or on the trunk. Whereas if we make a short piece of shari that starts on one side and then disappears around the end, and then we start another piece of shari on another side and have it disappear around the other end, even though all we did is make two short straight sharis, it'll make it look like the trunk spiraled around twice because we just suggested a small hint. And so I'll say that's one of the most common mistakes in deadwood design, is that people want to do it all at once. They're all in a hurry and they just do a big stripe all the way up the tree. Now, honestly, some trees are just going to look like that and that's fine. But if you have the ability to do something more interesting, aim for that. And so that's what we're going to do today. One of the first things I do is I'll pull off a lot of the flaky bark. You know, if you're not trying to preserve the flaky bark on a tree, I'll go around and I will either use my hands for big pieces of bark and just pull whatever I can, you know, grab a hold of. I will use tools like, here's two metal tools I'll commonly use. This is a long, kind of slender pointing tool. If you see it from the side right here, you can see it kind of curves up a little bit. And you can use this to just very gently carve away the outer layer of bark. And it's a great way of removing those outer layers. And don't work quickly. Even your first try, you can do great deadwood work on trees if you work slowly. It's whenever you're trying to work too quickly that you tend to, you hear whoops a lot more frequently. Another tool you can use is kind of a spoon-shaped tool. And what's cool about the spoon-shaped tools are they tend to have a little bit of a curve, and they're great for reaching underneath a flake of bark and just kind of popping it off. And it's a lot safer than the sharp one because it's way less likely to cut in. And so this is how you can do that kind of live wood work. And what I'll often do is just do a very rough initial work when I'm, get that branch out of the way, when I'm doing the deadwood styling, because, well, you'll see why in a second, because I want to draw actually right on the trunk where I want the deadwood features, and it's really hard to draw on big flakes of bark. Now, what's another good tool for getting started? Lots of different brushes, a toothbrush, a brass brush, whatever. You want to make sure it's firm enough brush to actually do any good, but you want to make sure it's not so sharp that it cuts through the bark and you see the lifelines. In other words, stainless steel brushes are good for deadwood, but not for live bark. And so for a really rough first pass, a brush can be a great way to just start getting rid of those outer flakes. Do any of you have favorite ways of taking off the live bark on the outside? And so I'm not going to do this whole thing, but I wanted to suggest what this works look like and kind of what the different tools are. Now, let's say I've done an adequate job of this. The next step is to find out, well, what are we going to carve? What's going to be alive and what's going to be dead? One of the first things I noticed about this tree is we have what? Oh, where's that guy? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dead branches all in a row. What does that tell us? What it tells us is that the line on which they all grow is likely completely dead, and that we can carve all of these into gin or maybe remove them entirely, and we're not hurting the tree at all because there's no sap flow in this area already. And you can start to see that down here where, and I can see it even shows up on the camera, there's kind of a fin or a lump starting right here. That's a good lifeline, and it runs all the way up the trunk along here. We want to preserve that, but what we can do is draw a line around that that kind of goes around all of these dead twigs, and we know that we can carve that with impunity. And so this is your clue as to what your tool is for doing that. Sharpies or markers, piece of chalk is a fantastic tool for that. And you can actually just draw right on the bark, kind of marking out the area that you want to preserve. And you can either draw the lines or you can kind of completely fill in where you want to do the deadwood. Now, already I'm starting to think of a few caveats, and maybe you all can think of some. You can't put deadwood wherever you want it on a tree because of things like the lifeline. If the phloem, or the layers of the trunk right underneath the skin of the bark, are responsible for transporting nutrients, hormones, water across the tree, if we get rid of all of that, it's going to kill the tree, or at least kill off a part of the tree that we might have otherwise have wanted to keep. And so when we're drawing a line like this, what we're going to do is make sure we're not going to kill a branch. And knowing that these branches are dead tells me that this is a great place to start drawing. But there's one other thing we want to check, and that's the root. If this is a collected tree and there was only one root on this entire tree, let me get down there a little lower. If the only root on the whole tree was at the bottom of all of this wood that we plan to carve, I would not carve that. I would preserve it. But fortunately, I can see there's a healthy root over here to one side. There's a healthy root on the other side. These areas I'm going to leave alone, and I want to carve right along here where all of these guys are. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, what's nice is you can see from this angle that even though the trunk is really, really straight at the very bottom, notice how quickly that piece of shari or future shari will start curving. And what that does is give us an opportunity to connect the shari kind of off screen. If I turn the tree back to the front, what you'll find is we might pick up a little bit of deadwood right here where it starts coming out of the soil. It'll come right across the front of the tree. And then we can maybe bring it around and down underneath at a future date. And by doing so, it'll make it look like there's a twist in the trunk, even though there wasn't when it was created. Instead, what I might do is, as I follow this really healthy line that I want to keep, what I might do is say, well, where's another area I might want to carve? And for that, let's see, we can zoom out a tiny bit here. There's a dead branch right here. Let's see, can you see it better from the side? That one's kind of hard to see. Oh, there it is. You can see this dead branch right here. That's a perfect view of it. Right below a branch is a really easy place to carve because you know it's always going to be dead underneath. And as you can see, there's already kind of a depression in the trunk where the lifeline has been growing around that. And so as a candidate place to carve, I might just follow the contour that's in the trunk and mark that out as a second candidate shari that we can carve. Does this process make sense at all? Do you have any questions? Do you think you would be able to identify places you might be able to safely carve or not carve based on what we've just kind of talked about?
I think so. I think that I've noticed also, unless it's just an illusion, that where you're putting the black marking pin, a lot of times it looks like the live vein is a little bit more swollen.
Precisely. And that's very much on purpose. One question came up about ribbons. And so here we can, zoom out a little bit literally and talk about how these trees were made and kind of the good and bad things about them. The way this tree was made is John took a really long whip, kind of like this long branch here, wired it all, twisted it up, or maybe tied it to a stake. I forget if it was wire or a stake originally, and gave it this interesting form. But and then he just let it grow for the next 10 years in the ground. What he didn't do is twist, twist, twist as he was going around, because that would have given us all these spirals. Now, more closely connected to what you're saying about the swelling, you'll notice there's no deadwood on the tree as it grew. This thing was left completely alone. And what happens when you have no deadwood is if you took a cross section anywhere along the trunk, it would be almost a perfect tube. And there's almost no more boring shape on a juniper than a perfect tube. Whereas if some deadwood had been made, say there's a little bit of deadwood made right at this point right here, there would be no more growth right here. I guess that's the spot I'm trying to point to right there. And if it never grows there, that means the rest of the tree would get bigger, 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 and it would start growing out in one direction. What if you opened up and did 2 pieces of shari? Well, the tree would never grow in this area and it would never grow in this area. It would just get wider and wider and wider and wider. And if you killed all of the deadwood on a trunk except for one little part, it would just grow in one direction. And if you have a young tree, that's how you make a tree with a really interesting shape to it, is carve that deadwood when it's really young, twist the tree, and then what'll happen is all of the lifeline will be forced to grow in one skinny spot, and it'll just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It'll swell, and that's what gives you a fin. And so even if you didn't follow that, I know I didn't really demonstrate it. I have an idea for a future post where I do demonstrate that. You can imagine if I kill all of this tree except for one skinny lifeline, that's the only part that's going to swell, and it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And the rest will stay exactly the same. And that gives us that awesome variation in trunk shape that we just don't see in field grown trees in this country, mostly because it takes a lot of effort. Does that help a little bit, Kathleen?
So if the tree
Yeah.
doesn't have that ribbon,
Uh-huh.
how do you know where you can and can't cut? Can you cut anywhere if it's all flat and you can't see where the live is?
And so if it's all perfectly flat, you get to choose where those lines are going to be. And what you want to watch is kind of the grain of where the bark is flowing. And you can't just carve barber stripes in straight grain because you'll kill the tree. But what you can do is say it's perfectly straight. You can actually start curving up, start straight, and then maybe do a little bit of a curve and just stop there. And then a year later, you can extend the curve. And then a year later, maybe extend the curve around the side. And over time, you can start suggesting a little bit of movement where there isn't. And in that case, the one thing I'd recommend is starting to keep in mind, if I kill off the outside of a curve and all the lifeline is in the middle, over time, the inside of a curve is going to get flatter and flatter and flatter as this fills in, because this will grow and grow and grow until it's full. And then you won't even notice there's a little hook in the trunk right here. Whereas if I put deadwood in the middle and I keep lifeline on the outside of the branch will get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it'll actually increase the visual nature of that curve, which is really cool. Does that help at all, Carmen?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, cool. So I won't go to the time to kind of designing the whole thing, but I wanted to make sure you understood what went into kind of how I decide where to carve. Now, how we actually do the carving, we'll get a different set of tools for that. And let's see, we've got a whole bunch of tools for carving shari, but there's kind of a couple main categories. The most common would be a knife. Zoom in again on this. And I use a grafting knife all the time when I carve. It's a fantastic tool. I actually have 2 grafting knives, one just for carving, one just for grafting, where I keep the blade crazy sharp. But you can simply trace the line you want to carve with a knife and do the deadwood like that. They also make a tool that's made kind of just for that. It's a whittling or carving tool, and you can see it has a point on one side and it is flat on the other. And so what that allows me to do is, let's see, I can show you here. It allows me to press very firmly, and I'll do this right now. I'll press, actually I won't do it because I left out the most important carving tool. Some of you might be able to guess. Have any of you ever used these before? Your Michael Jackson gloves? And these are cut-proof gloves. I haven't tested them, but theoretically, there is metal in there, which will help with accidental punctures and definitely with slices. And I mostly wear them depending on what kind of carving I'm doing, but if I'm demonstrating safe carving techniques, it behooves me to show you all, hey, these things are great, and whatever the money they ask for them, and they happen to be cheap, it's definitely worth it. And so now I can press as hard as I want on here, and I'm going to press all the way in to the wood. You can see it's stuck in almost 1/4 inch. And then I can just kind of trace the line down that I drew for myself. Now, are you going to be able to follow that line perfectly? Probably not. Am I going to be able to follow it perfectly? Probably not. But with practice, you kind of get you get an understanding of how soft the wood is and kind of how much you can do with it, and you kind of get used to it. But you want to push so it's all the way in, and then kind of follow that. Get the light on the tool. There we go, where you can get to where you want to go. And you take your time and you just trace out that line all the way across. And now you can understand why I don't plan on doing the entire deadwood of this whole tree today, because that would take quite a bit of time. But what's great is after you have separated that initial line, you can kind of peel away a piece of it and then just kind of pull off what you've done. And if all goes well, it'll roughly follow along with the lines that you have drawn. Kind of like that. And then if I did it right at the bottom, I should be able to pull, and it'll separate without going down into the root. And then from there, you just make additional lines, additional pulls, additional lines, additional pulls. Any questions so far?
So is that dead or is that alive?
It was alive, and it will no longer be alive. This white color is healthy pith. These are the phloem cells, and I'm trying to cut down through them to kind of show what the heartwood or xylem cells look like below that, as they're a different color. And one interesting thing about this is there's one tip that I would like to leave you all with, which is actually pretty important for the styling, and it's also fairly often missed. A lot of people think, hey, I peeled the bark, I am done. That's all my job is when making deadwood. It's no longer alive. They call it deadwood. How can I have done it wrong? Because it's now dead. And I'll say, it's not that it's wrong to stop after you separate the lifeline, but you have an opportunity to do something that'll make the deadwood work a lot more compelling. And what that is it's summed up neatly in the phrase, the first time you make a shari, make it a very deep shari. And the reason for that is, and I think it'll be pretty clear to see as soon as I remove this last little piece of the kind of those soft layers on the outside. There we go. So you see that kind of yellowy color right there? That's the heartwood. It's this skinny, pithy stuff is the live part, but this is the sapwood. And you'll notice it's perfectly smooth. And so, Dodie, when you asked about that wonderful sinuous juniper, if it looked carved or natural, this is perfectly smooth, and that's natural. And that's one way that that can happen, is if a branch dies off and no more trauma happens to it, you'll end up with just baby skin smooth deadwood on there. But as I mentioned, we still have a very round tube. And so what I want to do at this point is add some depth to the shari and actually cut into the heartwood. And for that, I need a different set of tools. Now, another category of tool we can use for removing the bark are these bark strippers. And what they are little loops, and they're just fantastic. You can see they come in a variety of sizes. You can have big ones, you can have round ones, and you can have pointed ones. And they are a ton of fun to use in that, let's see if I can find a spot here. Actually, one way to do it is I can just exaggerate the line I just drew. If you just grab a chunk of bark, press down, and you just pull, it'll actually just strip away a stripe of bark right where you're pulling. It's that easy. And so you can pretty much just draw with this as if it's a pen, and the deadwood will come out right in the exact line you cut. And I'll show you another use for these later when we talk about, coming back to deadwood you created the year before. But these are a really good way to strip off the bark. They make the work really easy. If I want to make that deep shari I talked about, I'm going to need a different kind of tool, and we have a few options for that. We can use something like a chisel or a gouge, and a gouge is a type of chisel. Let's see if I can get that in focus here. It's round, and it's not only round on the end, but if you look from the side, it's kind of scooped like this. And what that allows me to do is I can actually grab a little piece of deadwood in here. And work and find a tiny little flake. I know it's hard to see, but there's a tiny little flake of wood coming out there. And from there, I can either grab that with my finger or use the most important carving tool of all, pliers. I can grab this strip that I have cut and I can pull it. There, you see that coming out right there?
Mm-hmm.
And this, Dodie, is the answer to your question. How do you make it look natural? If you take away nothing from this entire talk, take away the idea that the way you can avoid tool marks is by literally pulling the wood, separating the wood away from the tree and letting the natural grain be the finish on the tree. If you end up with grain, it's just automatically going to look natural. There's one huge caveat to this, and you'll see it really shortly. We are now carving away very fresh wood, and this is known as a live vein carving technique. And it's hard to do a bad job because the wood is soft. It's very easy to grab a piece of wood. You just stick some kind of a tool in there, you get a little teeny tiny flake, and then again, you grab it with the pliers and pull, and you will just reveal wood grain. It looks fantastic. If the wood died 3 years before, it's going to be hard as a brick. And so I'll show you some different techniques for that. But if you are carving something, go out of your way to take the time within a week or two of when you make this initial shari work, because waiting longer is going to make it really, really hard to get the look you want for it. Let me get the light in there a little better. There we go. Now, in terms of what kind of pliers you can use for this, any of your standard bonsai pliers are fantastic for this work, or you can use gin pliers. And there's two differences that distinguish gin pliers from standard pliers. And one is they typically are angled at a cant. And the reason for that is twofold. One, it's very ergonomic for what you're grabbing. But the other is, and I'll show you how this works. Let me grab another piece of deadwood here. When you have a little bit of deadwood, if say I'm grabbing a really big piece, when you grab it with a gin plier, because the back is round, you can actually use that as a lever to pull away the piece of bark you're doing. And I use that all the time because you can just roll right along the surface of it, and that gives you tons of leverage, which you get a little bit of leverage with your normal pliers, but you get a lot more when you use the gin plier. But if you just have normal $5 hardware pliers, those are fantastic for making gin. You don't need anything fancier than that. And so if I had all day to work on this, I would continue grabbing pieces of bark, separating them, and then grabbing them either with my finger or a pair of pliers. And I would go down fairly deep because that's going to give me a little more dramatic feeling. Now, sometimes the question comes up, do you need cut paste at the sides where you make the wounds? And you can, but you actually don't need that. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't, but you can actually just kind of leave a clean cut. And if it's not clean, again, you can come back with your grafting knife or your carving tool, or even an X-Acto knife, honestly, and you can just kind of shave right along the inside of a cut. And as long as it's clean, it will heal over and in time look nice. You can get rid of whatever kind of frass or little bits of bark or happen to be left over right along that line where you've carved. Oh, there it is. You can see a little better right along there. Now you notice I stopped short on this big branch right here, and I kind of want to go through and do kind of a quick work on these guys. Any questions at all about the shari we've done so far?
No, but I think I indicated to you, Jonas, before we started, and there were all these people here, that I have a squirrel that has attacked one of my trees, and he's done some damage to the maple. But what I kind of wondered is that it looks sort of natural, I would think. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I'm wondering if that were applied to a tree, would that be a good look? Otherwise, I mean, I know that it's hurting the health of this particular tree, but
Do you want me to share it?
yeah, would you mind showing
go for
Jonas
it.
what the marking looks like?
Can you all see it?
Oh, interesting. And so is the bark otherwise alive there? It just, that looks more like scratchings in the bark, or did it go through the bark to the sapwood below?
Well, I think that it's not going to hurt the sapwood. I think it's more of a surface thing on this maple.
That's what it looks like to me. And so, boy, in that case, there's not a lot to do. You just kind of leave it and hope that it just, we're just going to call that character. I don't know that you need to add to it to add character, but if you did want to make, pretty much your options are you either leave it alone or you open it up with the aim of either healing it over time or preserving it as a deadwood feature in the future. Have you thought about which of those approaches would be a good fit for the tree?
I haven't, because right now it's covered in leaves. And so I had thought about defoliating it so I could evaluate the situation. But then I thought the leaves are part of what are keeping the squirrels from having that access. So I sort of just came to a standstill.
Yeah, the squirrels were eating one of my sheds today. I would love to know what makes it so appealing to them. But it really stinks when they're working on your trees like that, because it's a lot faster to undo a lot of work than it is to redo that work, which they so callously undid. And so, yeah, I tend to leave, especially when it's more surface damage like that, I tend to leave it rather than open it up. In fact, where they ringed around the base of my beech trees, so far I've just left it to see, because I can't tell what's alive, what's dead. Some places they definitely went all the way through to the heartwood, some places they didn't. And so I want to kind of take cues from where the tree or how the tree's healing before I decide to open up or apply cut paste. But I do plan to put lots of cut paste over those wounds in that case, because my model of what a beech looks like doesn't include rings of deadwood around the base of every trunk. And it's kind of terrifying, honestly. So
sure, that's
a different one. So let's move on to doing some gin, and then I can work kind of on some different parts of the tree and just kind of show you what the work looks like. And so if I were, yeah, go ahead.
I have mostly young trees. I'm very new at this. And where your finger is, and say directly on the other side of the tree.
Yeah.
That piece right there. The junipers that I have are about, the trunk is about that size. Now, my understanding is, and this is kind of a broader question than what you're doing right now, but my understanding is from what you like to do is take a young tree like that, twist it, I mean, dramatically. I've seen some of your videos, and I mean, you turn them into, it's pretty cool to watch. So you add some character and twist to a trunk of that size. Would you carve it at the same time or before you twist it, or how would that work? Or would you do one or the other?
Or both? I would.
Both is more fascinating to me.
Yeah, so when the tree's really young, I have tried doing just cutting say I took a tree that kind of looks like, where's this branch here? So say I have a tree this size, I have actually skinned away all the bark on one side of it, then wired it and then twisted it. But knowing how aggressively I twist these things, it's really easy for the bark to separate and the branch or tree to just completely fall apart. What I'm more likely to do is wire something like this, twist it, grow it hard for a year, and then in a year or two, maybe I'll rewire it the next year to make sure I have all the bends I want. And then what I'll do is I'll grab a branch and I'll actually just kind of pull. It'd be like grabbing this branch, pulling, and then seeing what deadwood naturally falls as you pull that live branch away. And I'll either pull a whole bunch of things, or I'll just grab my grafting knife and let's see, this will actually be an example right here, is you can just literally carve one side of that whole thing and not even worry about it. Kind of like that, assuming it's already been carved. And then that you'd be twisting if it's already been carved. But so that's what I'm planning on doing, is taking something this size, wiring it for a couple of years, then coming back in and then following the lifeline, either pulling strips away or carving all the way around so that I've got this nice spiraling piece of deadwood there. And then you grow that out for the next 10 to 20 years, depending on the size of the tree you want. Does that help a little bit?
And how old you are.
That's great. Then I'll need to find somebody younger to give the tree to because I'll be dead.
That's what I was thinking.
Well, that's how I feel about every one of my trees. It's very convenient to say as long as they're in your backyard, but I'm taking care of all of my trees right now. This tree has no reason why it can't outlive me by a large margin. And so I'm taking care of it now. Hopefully someone else will do a much better job taking care of it when I'm done with it, whether that's next year or 20 years from now. And so I kind of think of every one of my trees in that same breath. Just because I work on a tree leaves me no expectation that it'll ever be finished. And on my watch, I just want it to continue to get better kind of year after year after year.
All right, thank you. That's great.
Cool. So if I want to make this look a little more natural, it kind of looks perfectly straight and it kind of looks like it's been cut, probably because it was just cut, and that's all there is to it. So there are two different kinds of approaches we can take with gins like this, and I'll briefly demonstrate both before I kind of take more time with it. One is you can take either a curved tool like this guy, or some of them just have right angles to them. These are draw knives, and you can just grab hold and start whittling away until you get a nice point on it. Now, this is going to be a lot harder to carve because this branch was killed off a couple years ago. But you can see that even as old as this wood is, it doesn't take too long. By the way, never keep a hand downstream of where you're carving. Obvious, but you'd be surprised how many times that's relevant. And so when you see points on pieces of deadwood, this is often where the points come from, are people carving like this. And so you can see very quickly, great, I sharpened my pencil. Still doesn't look totally realistic, but it did at least give me some ability to contour. And if I get really fancy, I can kind of make it look a little more curved rather than perfectly straight. I can actually start carving out multiple sides of it. I can even do kind of twisting cuts, which kind of lead to a more interesting shape. It's harder on a small scale like this, but that's one approach. The other approach is the far more common one we use. And that would be, you cut off the branch kind of a little bit past where you want to work with it. And then this is best done with a root cutter. And so root cutters are the cutters where the two blades meet almost perfectly flat like this. And what you do is, I'll do it so you can see it kind of in cross section, is you make a couple cuts and you make kind of cross cuts. And so I'm just splitting the wood top to bottom like that. And then I'm doing the same thing side to side like this. Actually, that tool's too big. I need a smaller root cutter. Oh, or a trunk splitter or a branch splitter. Any one of those will work. So this is a smaller root cutter, and this is known as a trunk splitter or branch splitter, and it does the exact same thing. And so I can reach in here, and again, I'm just trying to cut the branch into quadrants like that. And now I've got kind of a north, south, east, west in there, and I can get in there with my pliers, grab a hold of any one of those quadrants, and just start peeling away at it. Let's see. So if I'm on this side of the tree, I can grab one of those and just kind of pull it away from the middle, kind of like that. And sometimes you'll get really wonderful shapes that appear. Sometimes it'll be super boring and perfectly straight. And based on kind of what techniques you use for pulling, how straight the grain is, how dry the wood is, you're going to get very different effects. And you'll notice that I'm just kind of pulling and pulling and twisting until I'm lining up with the shari that I've carved right below this branch. So the top piece, I'm going to kind of bend backward and pull it toward the trunk. This piece is going to go toward the back. And I'm not going to be able to put much movement into this because we started with a very straight branch. But what I can do is use the branch to get that deeper shari that I want. And you can see I'm really getting inside that deadwood there, and I can pull it all the way down that line and extend it all the way to fairly low, to the point where it's so low that I actually want to use a scissor to cut it because I don't want to pull it all the way down into the root. So I'll just cut that right there. See, get my gouge to pull away, see what I've done a little bit better. Yeah, and so I'm starting up a little kind of hole in this area right here. I know it just looks like messy wood, but those are kind of the basic techniques. But you notice how from the side now, it kind of has rough edges. That's how you get those kind of rough and uneven shapes. Plus it's a lot shorter, which I like. When a gin is really long, when it's really straight, I don't want it to be long. Long curves are good. Otherwise, short and straight is good. And so maybe for now, that's my rough draft of the gin on this. If we were to step back on the bigger picture of the whole tree, where's the heaviest branch going to be? Very low on the trunk. Does it make sense to have a teeny tiny little pokey thing this low on the trunk? Maybe not. If I just break it off accidentally or decide I don't need it, it might be that the tree will look better off without that. Maybe it just makes it look busy. Here's where your personal styles are going to kind of come into play. And so I've got all of these other branches lined up right above it, and I'll be doing kind of the exact same thing. And so an accelerated version of that might look like I just grab the top of this with a cutter, kind of squeeze halfway through if I can, and just immediately start breaking it away and twisting. Maybe I'll just grab a corner of it and I'll just kind of grab whatever I can and twist, and that'll be opening up the wood as I go. And notice I can pull it safely down because it's just going to go straight into the shari that we're working on down here. So it's a very safe place to work. And by doing this instead of by whittling, we're going to end up with a much more natural looking deadwood because it's going to be the shape of the grain, not the shape of what we've carved. And so does that start to answer your question, Dodie, about how you make it look natural versus how you just make it look like someone just set their tools down?
Yes, you make it look easy.
Well, the funny thing is we're tearing a tree apart. It's not that it's hard. It's more a matter of we tend to be in a rush and we tend to do it really fast. And that's why I always recommend people start learning how to carve with hand tools instead of with power tools. Because if you're really steady, you can do the same thing, but you're more likely to leave tool marks, and you might go, and it just dives way in there and you make a whole mess of it. And so becoming familiar with how the wood responds to hand tools is a great first step in learning how to carve with power tools, because what it does is it teaches you how the wood's going to respond to these various techniques, and it tells you what the wood should look like when you're actually working with the grain instead of working with a really sharp carving bit that spins really, really quickly.
Would it have been easier if you had done this whole thing with those branches green?
Oh man, is it easy. But that's why I wanted to kind of show you both, because you're going to find if you buy a tree, it may not have every branch on it. And so you're going to have to learn different techniques. Boy, I did carving on an olive once that Sam Medina had come up with. And this thing had been dead and sawed off for years. And olive wood is hard as a rock once it dries. And so for that technique, I wasn't even able to do what I'm doing here. I was taking a hammer and a chisel and then popping off flakes of it, kind of one little flake at a time. And that was a really not the most fun afternoon I spent carving that. But what's cool is because I was letting the grain determine the nature of the deadwood, once the carving discolored, it actually became really hard to tell what was carved and what wasn't. And so I was happy with the way that turned out. And so if I were to do it even faster, so what you see people doing demos is they'll grab a hold of a branch like this, they'll shorten it, they'll kind of grab it and twist it. And if it happens to break halfway through, they'll peel off the bottom, literally cut it off like that, grab the bark on the top and say, you know what, we're done, next. And then they come to the big one. And then they'll grab their trunk splitter or root cutter, make a cut or two, and then get their pliers and just start grabbing it and see what happens. And so in demos, when you've got a whole lot of these to do, it can actually go pretty fast. And then you do kind of a second draft of your deadwood somewhere down the road where you're refining all of those cuts you made. And so I thought it'd be a lot more valuable to, rather than just do this whole tree and say, see, isn't that fun? Is to kind of just take apart how I do each of the steps so that you can try to figure out which effects you like, which effects you don't like, so that when you work on your own trees, you can make a little more informed decision. Maybe if I want to leave it thicker at the bottom, I can now come back with a draw knife and clean off some of the bark at the base. Of course, because it's dead and dry, it's really, really hard, but still possible. And so when I do carving, I tend to have many, many tools at hand when I'm doing this kind of work. And you just never know. You know, there's little things like this guy here. I think of it as one of my most dangerous tools. Super useful for whittling in small spaces because it has a point that's very, very sharp and it has blades along the sides. And so what I can do is that piece I just made here, I can actually come in here and just whittle away the bark or change the shape a little bit just by using the side of the tool. And
What
it's
is
a
that
great
tool
way
called
to
again?
So funny you ask. So as some of you may know, I have an online tool store. And when I started carrying tools like this, I thought, well, wait a minute, what am I going to call this on the website? And so you look at the website in Japanese. And so I'm reading the Japanese website and it all translates into 7-inch carving knife number 7, 7-inch carving knife number 14, 7-inch carving knife. There's no names. And so I just had to make up names. And naming things is not my specialty. And so I'm not going to say I came up with any good names for any of them. I think I call this pointed tip carving tool or point tip carving tool. It's made by Kanashin. Very handy, very dangerous, but really nice for doing things like removing bark and kind of finishing up those areas that were a little harder to get to with other tools. Or again, if you don't have fancy carving tools, if you just have an X-Acto knife or a grafting knife, you can do all of this exact same work. And you can do a combination of carving and again, grabbing something with a cutter or a tweezer and putting a little point on it, revealing that grain. And you'll notice that just after just playing around for a couple minutes, this is still way too long, but notice how less distracting that section is than it was when it was all those big, long, straight things.
Mm-hmm.
It's too busy for my taste. I actually don't like it when it's that, when you have just a line of gin. The best thing I can do to make it look good now would be to actually come in here and scrape out the shari around the rest of that area, clean up all of that bark. And again, I don't know that I want to do that. What I find is you can do 80% of the work really quickly, and the last 20% takes quite a bit of time. I'm sure that surprises nobody. And but that's what makes the trees look really good. And so when you can give yourself the time to do this kind of work, you can get really good results even on a first attempt. Kathleen, do you have any trees that need carving right now in your collection?
Probably so. Yes, I do.
And are you going to be working with live branches or dead branches?
Dead, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I want to
So
say
be patient.
this is kind of inspiring me because I do have some dead branches that this is what,
Oh, what
I might
kind of
have
trees,
to do.
Lucy?
Shinpaku juniper.
Oh, nice.
Mhm.
And so I'm just making a mess of this whole area because I end up wanting to clear it out. But that's what I love about this tool is you can just draw right on the trunk, right where you want the deadwood, and it just comes right off just like that.
So Jonas, the tool that you're
Yeah.
using now that you're drawing with, does it have a name? And is it one that you sell?
Yeah, I have all of these, the small ones and the big ones. And I think I call it I just put all the carving tools on one page so you can see them all side by side. I think it's the 8 1/4 gin loop with a narrow tip or a round tip. Like this would be the narrow tip, this is the round tip. So these are the 8 1/4 gin loop, and I think these are the 10-inch gin loop.
Yeah.
Same thing with a round or a smaller point. And so depending on the size of the trees you have, different tools will make a lot of sense. But you've also noticed even to do one tiny little section, I might reach for 5 different tools. And so if you don't have 5 tools, it's easy because you're not switching tools all the time. But if you have all those different tools, you might find that you're switching between them a lot.
But now, one of the things this reminds me of, took an art class one time, and the teacher said something to me about, do you only have one brush? And it was because, you know, you want to have different brush strokes and for it to look more varied than what you can do with one tool.
Yeah, and that's as simple as a point that is, it's pretty insightful because you start getting to work and you think, oh, this is my carving tool, I'm doing my carving now. And it's like, no, it's not about the tool, it's about what the effect is you want to achieve on the tree. And we don't really care what the tools are, what the process looks like. What we care about is what the effect is when you're finished doing that work. And if that takes some experimentation and some different tools, then that's what it takes. And so these are kind of the absolute basics of getting started with the deadwood. I want to show you, kind of an example of what you can do to kind of lead up to that kind of work. But this is the kind of work you'll see people doing in demos. And now when you see a demo, you'll kind of know what someone's thinking about as they're making the tree. They're going to be identifying a lifeline. They're going to be finding natural hollows. They're going to be trying to carve through all of the pith to get to the heartwood underneath. And they're going to be, trying to come up with some kind of a design where there are fewer straighter lines and there are more different kind of shapes that they're producing. If you're starting from scratch, so I guess I could ask you all, you see there's a big long branch up here. How long do you think this should be? Should I keep it this long? Make it half as big, a quarter as big, or get rid of it all? Like what would your criteria be for how long to keep something that looks like that?
Cut it off.
I'll do at least half to
Keep
start
it
with.
longer, and then you can always cut more off later.
So why cut it off? What is the rationale for that?
Where's the front?
Let's go back to our front. Maybe.
Is it kind of inside a curve? It looks like it's in the curve.
It's kind of in the back. So that big long piece is this one right here. And so from the front, you notice most of it disappears right there. You can see it kind of sticking straight out right there. Does anyone want to leave it long? Can anyone make an argument for leaving it long?
No.
Well, to me, because it's in the back, might be longer than it would be if it's in the front.
Right, it might
see
add
it.
depth.
Right, because you don't really notice how long it is like you do from the side. And so if it had a little more movement, I'd be much more likely to keep it long. And you can carve some spirals in it, but the overall direction is going to be long. And so if kept, I would want it probably no longer than about half of that length. And so often what I'll do, let's see what side's going to be the best for you all to see this. Now, maybe we could do the same thing on this branch up here, but as I start to make deadwood, the first thing I'll often do is clip all of the foliage away. So let's get to where we can see it a little better.
Is
This is the
it at
fun
all
part. You all can do
pliable?
this part.
Would you be able to wire it and pull it down or move it instead of
Yes.
straight? Since
Let's
it's not
see.
dried up.
Yes,
Ooh, a
this is
little bit,
actually
yeah.
bendable, but you won't be able to put interesting curves in it.
No, oh, it's stiff.
So what we might be able to do is put a really strong bend in it. I'm just trying to see if it'll break. Really strong bend in it. And then maybe tie it down at that level. And then you can just let it sit there for a year. And then when you actually do make a gin later, you now have a short gin with a curve in it. I did that on the Sierra Juniper where I actually cut all the leaves off, just kind of like I'm doing here. And then I came back later and wired it and put a crazy, crazy shape in it because I didn't have to worry if it lived or died. And after a year or two, it's going to hold, even though the branch is dead, or at least it'll mostly hold. And so that's a really good trick if you have smaller gins. It won't work for huge things, but it's great for those kind of middle size. But just by clearing this away, you'll be able to see kind of what's going on in this area a lot better. There. The reason I decided to make this a gin is this is perfectly in the middle of a curve. You can see right there. And so we just don't need that at all. We don't need this at all. These guys are just gone. And I don't want a gin there either. And so actually, that might be a really good example. I could show you how to treat that. Let's see, let's bring this up here a little bit. This is the piece I want to focus on. So see how it's kind of on the inside of the curve? I know the light's not perfect there behind that branch, but maybe from the other side, it'll be easier to see. There we go. See how perfectly straight this is and right on the inside of a curve? We are never going to want that branch right there because it takes away from the natural curve. And so the way I will treat something like that is sometimes I will draw it first with a knife. And if you score it and get rid of all the bark all the way around, then you know that when you start pulling on the bark, you're less likely to pull a big strand of live bark that you actually want to protect. And so I'll press very firmly all the way around. And there's always going to be one surface that's a lot harder than the other ones to get to. And that's why it's really common to miss a small section. So you have to be careful when you actually do the pulling. And so I will there, press very firmly. And now for stripping the bark, the most common technique is, and this probably won't work because this is so dried out, but you can actually come in with the pliers and just kind of squish it all the way along. I'll have to do this with a live branch to show you. And if you squish it kind of on, left and right and then up and down, if you just squish the bark, then you can kind of come in with your hands and it should just peel right off. There, that actually worked just fine, didn't it? And now we have, you can see the gin there. So see, that's how easy it can be. You just cut around the sides, squish it, pinch it with the pliers, and then the skin will pop right off. And that's pretty good because this was cut quite a number of months ago. Now, if I was going to continue to make a little bit of a shari there, I might want to create a little bit of a shape right below that. And that's where I'll start making a little bit of a shari. So same kind of thing, cut right below it. And again, I want to press really far in there because the pith is pretty thick on this tree. And what that's going to do is make it harder for me to accidentally pull off way too much bark. So now if I can get underneath there, maybe pinch it with my finger or the pliers, I can then pull off that little bit of bark underneath there. And sometimes it comes off nicely, and sometimes you just fuss with it and fuss with it and fuss with it. And that's a less fun time. The other thing you can do is, again, keep grabbing different tools. I think the reason I use so many tools is I'm not patient. And so if the tool I have in my hand is not doing what I want immediately, there's just no reason not to set it down and try again with another tool. There we go. Now I can get a little bit of space there. See, I just opened up that little bit right underneath. And so now when I start carving this guy, I am less likely to do some big damage down below. So I'm just going to cut it shorter and then start breaking it apart in pieces and just, maybe I'll use a smaller one now. Oh, the angle one will be good. And what I'm just doing is grabbing a piece of it. And once I get a piece of it, I'm going to try to get in there with some pliers and see how well I can bend this down out of the way so that I can remove the branch all the way down into the wood below it. And this is honestly, I think I've just proven to you all why chainsaw demos are so popular, because this is just a lot slower and a lot more kind of detail oriented than it is when you're just grinding away at something. But if you get started with these kind of techniques, you're going to learn a lot more about how the tree grows and have control and be less likely to make huge mistakes along the way. And so I'm just pulling pretty firmly on that, and I'm finding that that is not going to be a good way to grab that because it's just too, depending on the angles at which the branches grow out, sometimes they peel away immediately. And in this case, it's just kind of exploding. And so, there we go.
It's rather like a reverse engineering.
It really is. Depending on how it grew, because it's in that kind of gap like that, I'm not able to get as deep as I want, which is what you want, is to be able to grab something deep and then follow those lines on down below. But instead, I'm more or less just grabbing what I can and cutting it off, which means having all the time in the world. I'll show you kind of exactly what my next step would be. And you'll find I'm leaning on even more tools here. So for this, I go straight to the hammer and chisel. And what I would do is, let's see, I think about a slightly smaller chisel, is I kind of like before, where I want to get in there fairly deep. And so I'll just line up the kind of gouge where I want it and just hit it with the hammer. And that's going to get right through there in no time. There. And so the fact that I spent as much time as I did is just a perfect example of, I just didn't reach for the right tool fast enough. And if you're not grabbing as much wood as you want, you can just grab a wider gouge and do the exact same thing. And gouges are really fun because with the round edges, you can do a pretty big area pretty quickly. And I won't do too much of that. I assume the audio can't be too interesting to hear tapping. There. But you can see once you get the right tool in there, you can get a pretty good shape. So there, I thought I'd be showing you an example of one thing, but I ended up doing another. That's how you start opening that up. And now, instead of having a perfectly straight branch sticking out here, we've got the start of a shari, which I can start bringing down here. And if we were to grab the Sharpie again, what I would want to do is extend this line down around the back a little bit. It looks like it comes down here, and then we can spin it around here. And that's how I can make it look like the tree's twisting. Yep, I'm sorry, let me zoom out a little bit. This shari here will spin around and disappear to the back right there. this shari here will actually be exaggerated until it follows this line. It'll come down here and then go off to the side down there. And that will leave this one very important ribbon of lifeline here, which will go in between the two, and it'll make it look like there's a full twist where there's actually no twist. Whereas if I just started pulling on it, it would end up being much more straight. And so that's why we're doing it with a more gradual approach. And so those are kind of the basics of the basic techniques. And I've got time to answer tons of questions. I also have time to work on any of these big guys. And so I'll just keep working on that. But I'd say if you all have questions now would be a great time to have me either demonstrate a tool or a technique on any of these branches that you're curious to know more about.
That was a beautiful job, the way that you were able to make that look like a curve.
Oh, thank you. That's my favorite thing, is to introduce curves where there aren't any, because I think it's one of the more neglected techniques, and it's really easy, but it just requires that little bit of patience where you don't make all the deadwood all in one go. Now, what do you think has stopped you all from making deadwood in the past?
Fear.
Fear of what? What do you think is what is it? Because I know you used the phrase, I don't want to mess it up, but what does messing it up entail when we're making deadwood?
Not knowing what pieces to take off.
And if you take off the wrong piece, what's the result going to be? Meaning, why is that a problem? Why is it bad to take off the wrong piece?
Might not maximize the potential of the composition, maybe.
That's right. Our fear is that it just might not be as pretty. Well, yeah, killing the tree.
Yeah.
If you do something really aggressive, you do run a risk, obviously, of losing the life of the tree. But in general, we're just afraid that we're going to cut off something that took a long time to grow and that we're not going to be able to get it back. And so depending on what part of the tree we're working on and what the age of the tree is, that either will or won't be a big concern. And that's another reason why I really recommend working with young material, because the stakes are very low.
Are you going to kill that bottom branch down there?
Which is this the one I'm working on right here?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I tried to kill it a couple years ago when I cut it back, but it budded back after cutting off all the foliage. Sometimes on a juniper, you can actually cut below everything and it'll still bud back when it's really healthy. And that's kind of what happened here.
And thinking about the question you asked about why haven't you done a lot of deadwood work, I think part of it is that so much of the deadwood on my trees is not the younger stuff, it's the stuff that's been hardened off and is so.
It's not as fun, is it?
No, when you have that bark, it's been really fun when you have that bark that'll just peel off, and you can. I've enjoyed that work on deadwood, but not the hardwood.
Yeah, working with old deadwood is a challenge, and that's when it's good to have helpers nearby who can do the hard parts while you offer guidance. And you're just being really generous because you're offering them the opportunity to learn all these techniques which you're describing, and you're letting them practice on it. In the meanwhile, you're saving yourself from potentially cutting yourself and blisters and anything else. And so
there you
that's
go.
one trick. That's one trick that I learned, because I was always the sucker that was carving other people's trees. It's like, hey, Jonas, want to help with this? Sure.
So I have a problem of a tree that it was a juniper that was taken out of somebody's yard, and they just sawed through it. So I've got these pieces that are like a 6 inches long stub that's about 3 inches wide. So I've been looking at them now for about 3 years.
Oh,
and
God.
I've started doing that, but it's like, how am I ever going to make this look right?
Do you have squirrels?
Yeah. I have a dog. I could let her
Oh, there you go.
throw it across the yard and see what happens.
How straight are those 6-inch, 3-inch diameter stubs?
They're kind of straight, but as I'm pulling it back where I'm using the pliers and twisting it back, I am getting these deep down, it goes in really deep. So there is some interest to it.
Nice.
Yeah. But at the end, you've got this big, huge, round. So I've seen on where it looks weathered. So it still looks okay, even though it's fairly thick.
If you give me 2 seconds, I can run and show you that olive, which is a good example of uncarved wood, carved wood, and partially carved wood. And it'll be kind of, but it's about 4 inches across. And so it might be a good example of that. So I'm going to grab that and show you, and then I'll describe the technique I used to do that work. Just 1 second.
Carmen, do you have a photograph of the tree that you're talking about?
I do not. I took a photo of a different tree, thinking I wanted to talk about that, but I don't.
Okay.
Actually, I could check my photos.
Strange experience. Are you all there?
Yep.
Oh, good. It was a strange experience, and it was the first time I walked into the garden and selected a tree based on shape of the pot, because it was pitch black, and I'm like, I think it's in this aisle, and I was walking around feeling all the pots, and so.
That's impressive.
And so this is that olive I mentioned that I got at an awesome ABAS show years and years ago at McKinley Park. And as you can see, it's like a chunk cut out of a really big olive. And the top of it was perfectly straight. And so this actually used to come out to about here. And it was just a tube that was straight. And it had a perfectly square saw cut on it. And so the part that I carved is, let's see if I can kind of get up there, is kind of this area here. And you can see all of these marks that are actually, I carved every bit of this up here. I carved, and you can see where I didn't finish carving is the top, because it's kind of flat right here. And so it's a good example of kind of what I started with, and what I ended up with is I did half of it. And so how did I do this work? You're going to laugh when I kind of show you. Now, these flat areas were actually kind of naturally there. This is kind of some of the natural undulations in the Deadwood. Yeah, you can see it a little better. But it has this fantastic kind of ribbed pattern that would be really hard to recreate with a carving tool. So I thought, you know what? I want to keep as much of that as possible. But this is hard as a rock. So how did I do this? I took a chisel, a much bigger hammer than I'm going to show you. Let's just pretend I have the right tools here. These are way too delicate. But what I did is let's see, get an angle without those branches in the way. I would just stick the chisel. Let's get the camera over here, make it a little easier for you. I would just hold the chisel where I didn't want a piece of wood. I would tap, 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 and then break it away. And then tap, 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 break it away. Tap, 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 break it away. And I just did this for hours, peeling off just literally a tiny fleck at a time. I felt like I was carving marble, but even that's way more noble than it was. And after hours and hours and hours of hitting my hands and who knows what else, I was able to kind of start giving it shape. And at some point I gave up and said, you know what, I'm just done for now. I'll spend another 4 hours later. That was about 6 years ago. And I still haven't gotten back to it, but it's a lot better looking than it was. And it gives me some ideas for what I want to do to finish it up. You know, just again, give it a little more contour up toward the top.
It's so hard that it would never peel.
Oh, goodness, no.
No.
I mean,
Okay, at least mine peels. Yeah. It looks like a raven's head from the side.
That's right. Yeah, this is way, way past the peeling stage on this guy. But it's kind of a fun tree. I mean, the story of this one is it is died back so many times. And I mean, this is the first time I've actually had good growth on it in many, many years. The only part of the tree that's alive is this teeny tiny little lifeline right here. And that's why it was unfortunate when a few years ago I made 3 saw cuts this big on the bottom, and I more or less cut all the roots off when there was hardly any foliage up on the top. And so I didn't totally think that went out very well, but it's recovering now, so I'm just letting it grow as fast as it can. And then once it gets healthier, of course, I'll cut all of these branches off, regrow it out, and make a much more compact frame. I think the front is somewhere around here, something like that.
Okay.
Do you have to worry about that wood rotting?
Not even
Not
in
anytime
phase?
soon. Not anytime soon. And so we're really soft wood. I would put some wood hardener in there. I've used a couple different wood hardener products, but you notice even the sharp point of this, I can hit with a hammer. It's not doing a whole lot. I might be able to chip a little bit off. There we go. And that's kind of what it was like doing that gin work, was you just chip away. Gosh, I can't even tell where it was now. And you just chip away a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. So I guess for those stumpy junipers, I still can't recommend with a straight face a hammer and chisel method, but you might think, what is the overall shape you want the thing to have? And you want it to kind of come to a point one way. The biggest mistake is people end up with predictable spirals. You want the spirals to be a little uneven. You want them to undulate. And so it might be that you can create a couple basic channels. Maybe if you drew a couple different points, it's like, I want to go a little deeper right here, a little deeper there. And then you say, today's the first draft. And you start making those channels and just make sure the channels have some curves. You come back to it another day, you say, you know what, we're going to make these channels deeper. We're going to open a new channel and just make sure they have a little movement. And if you do it incrementally, even if you're not a sculptor at heart, then you can kind of get rid of the part of the gin that's not part of the future design and try to reveal the shape that's inside. I know that's not going to help at all, but that's at least how I think of it, which is do it incrementally, try to avoid straight things, and try to home in on that design as it kind of unfolds. Does that make any sense at all?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Oh, good. Just seeing this tree made me think if I had any other examples of funny Deadwood projects here, but overall I'm happy with it. It's surprisingly hard to see what part is carved when you look at natural straight sections, unnatural curvy sections, and then knobby natural sections. And this is just totally natural, you know, on the back. It was just, I did some Deadwood work in that area, but I just pulled off whole flakes. I think it came out to about here before. It's a lot more slender now. And that area, it used to bump out like that. It was actually really reverse tapery. And so I made it a lot narrower just by peeling off a section, peeling off, peeling off, peeling off. Same kind of technique, getting in there with a wedge, kind of prying it open and popping off what came away. But it's kind of funny at these nice natural fissures in here. These are the characteristics I want to preserve in the tree. And when I design it, what I want to do is have compact foliage in the middle, a little bit of branching here, a little bit of branching here, a little higher on one side, lower on the other. And that's it. Very, very simple design. But this is a really bad starting point, and I've got tons of dieback from when all the roots died. So, but I've got a new shoot too, so it looks like it's still alive. Any other questions about this tree or the juniper, any other species we might be playing with?
Do you know who the original owner of that tree was?
Oh, who?
No,
I got it from Sam. I don't know where it came from before that.
If it's from Sam, I bet you that tree is part of a tree that was over 100 years old.
I believe it, because this is a quartered off section of a much larger tree. And I know a lot of those were over 100 years old. That's cool.
And they came from Carmichael.
Oh, okay. Not too far away.
Is that part of the one I have? Then?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes, I heard someone else starting a question.
In response to your question is what has kept us from, making dead wood. I think you answered it there with time, because it does take a lot of time to do that, especially with larger trees. I have a lot of olives that have dead wood on them, and so what's kept me from doing that is just taking the time to do it.
So how do we get over that? Because that's my problem too. And the short answer is, well, if you don't have time for your trees, you have too many trees. And while that may be part of the puzzle, that's not the most helpful advice, is to tell people, well, get fewer trees, because I don't take that advice. I don't have time to work on all of my trees. So has anyone come up with some good solutions? I bought these, 13 trees years ago, and this is one that I've done some carving on, or some students of mine, I think, did some carving on it. I was going to show you how to do kind of touch-up carving a year later, but I don't have enough time to do it because it's not critical. It's easy to put off. And what I found is, whenever we put off a technique like wiring or carving that doesn't seem absolutely critical, the way fertilizing or defoliating is, we're actually exacting a cost on the trees. The trees will not develop as well. They will not become as refined if we take big breaks from the work that needs doing. And so the big reminder I'm really trying to focus on this year is that any work that needs doing, if I don't do it at the right time, it's going to come with a cost. And so even though this doesn't feel critical, I know that if I don't do this work, the tree will be not as good next year. Whereas if I do the work, it'll be better. And so what I wanted to show you on this juniper is it's from the exact same batch, and it's been carved once. And as you can see, I'll just spin it around once and then I'll zoom in and do it again. Some really good twists and turns on the tree, but some really straight sections as well. And so that made for some interesting decisions we had to come up with to style or design the tree. Now, let's see if I'm going to zoom in on this. There. So you can see there's actually some really great character at the base of the tree right there. This side's a lot less interesting. It's really straight at the bottom, and then there's just kind of a single curve up higher. And then we come to the best twist over here. And so the front will be somewhere probably in somewhere in one of these areas, because we get a little bit of interest at the base. We get a little bit of shari down here, a little bit of shari on the back, and then we get this great spiral right in the middle. So here's the work we do the second year, say 1 or 2 years later. At any given time, you can take off, at most maybe up to, actually, it depends on how good you are at lining up the lifeline with what needs to come off. A common rule of thumb is you can remove 1/3 of the dead wood at a time, between 1/4 and 1/3. If you're really good, and the best carver in the world, one of them is a Taiwanese guy who's just amazing. He'll take off 60% of the dead wood all in one day. I don't recommend that. I'd say aiming for 1/4 or 1/5 of the dead wood is plenty. But what I like doing is getting it started, watching it start to heal over, and then reopening it to add even more dramatic shapes to the trunk. And so you can see right here that a very small shari was made, and the live wood is already, that shari is 1/4 inch deep right now. It's really hard to see in the light, but actually you can just start to see it a little bit there. Because the lifeline is smaller, it's thickening up faster. And as it continues, if we widen the shari here, the trunk will get bigger and bigger in these two directions, but not in these two directions. And so that's where we're getting interesting shape. And so what I want to do is actually reopen up the inside of the shari to widen it a little bit. And you want to keep doing that on your trees pretty much fairly frequently over the years, because if you leave them alone, they're actually going to try to heal over those wounds. And that's usually the last thing you want. And so that's when I'll just take this tool, and you can see it's just great for giving me these skinny little strips of wood. And I can make the dead wood a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger incrementally. And so I'll take my first little bite right against the shari like that. And then I'll just take it a little bit wider and then a little bit wider, and see I'm getting these perfect strips of wood right here. There, this is a great example. And so every pass of the tool, I'm pulling maybe 1/8 of an inch of bark off, and I can just decide how long do I want this to be, how deep do I want it to be. And if I just do a little bit of this every year, I'm going to end up with a thinner and thinner lifeline, to the point where eventually I want this to be about 20% lifeline and 80% deadwood. Right now we're at the opposite. So it's going to take a number of years of pretty aggressive deadwood work to get to that goal of much less live wood, much more deadwood. And that's going to give us the best shape of the trunk, the most interest, and it'll help us exaggerate what shape there is in the trunk. Now, this is perfectly straight right here. I don't like that this section is straight. And so over time, we're going to start to make it a little bit curvier. And this whole section, I actually want this to be carved out all the way, probably for the next 2 inches. I want to remove all of that. I can't do that today, or else everything above that would die. And so for now, I'm just going to start widening it. And over time, I will just every year, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. These trees I found are great learning trees for doing deadwood, because those initial curves weren't set. And so it's a perfect opportunity to kind of teach yourself all of the techniques you need to turn kind of a monotonous tube of live wood into slightly more interesting deadwood. And when I do carving demos, I use these. When I do carving classes, I use these, and they're just really fun to work with.
Jonas, do you find that by doing a little carving kind of gives it a more unique aging process?
Yes, and specifically, what I find is that there are more types of character on the deadwood, and a little more contrast, whether in the colors of the wood. When you let it heal a little bit and then cut through it, let it heal a little, cut through, you can form these kind of layers that accrue over time. Whereas when you carve it all at once, when you expose the wood to the light or the air all at once, it's going to have a single character, and then you will just have lifeline and deadwood. Whereas doing it this way, I think it makes it a little easier to give yourself more kinds of complexity in the deadwood.
Yeah, that's what I'm noticing. Really neat.
Oh, good. Thanks. And I find that I have in the past worried a lot about the plan. And instead of worrying about the plan, I fall back on what are the best practices and what are the next steps. And so if the best practices make straight things curvy, I identify straight things and try to find ways to make them curvy. And if the next step is make it less straight, well, then that's a lot easier than designing the whole thing. And I find it's a good way to help people back into designs. And so they may not have a vision of, well, 12 years from now, this tree is going to be precisely 18 millimeters across in this section and 98 millimeters in that section. And it's going to be beautiful because it catches the light of the Coriolis effect, and they just need to start making stuff up. And so if you do it incrementally, what'll happen is you can kind of let whatever you're feeling that day guide the process. You can let what the tree, where it either has or hasn't healed, guide the process. And just think, I think there's a little too much right here, we need less. There's a little too little here, we need more. And you kind of go from there.
And you hit it on the head. I think it is a process and not, you don't do it, it's process, a little more and working on it. You have some really neat, that's a neat tool.
Yeah, it's really fun. And I agree. And so I think we're all trained to demos where there's a lot of pressure on whoever's on stage to do all of the work all at once and leave us a really pleasing thing. And so I think in a lot of demonstrations, we're always trying to push the limit of what can be done within, 2.4 hours, because that's how much time we have in front of the audience. And the more work we do, the better able we are to suggest what the future design of the tree is going to be. But when you're working on a tree in your own collection, hey, you got all the time in the world, go for it. And if you
Right.
don't have all the time in the world, or if you want to kind of learn with the tree over time, try that. And so that's what I think I most like about it, is these time-based processes in bonsai.
Mhm.
I also like it when multiple people work on the trees. And so for all I know, this is the first time I've worked on this tree, and I think it was students doing the work. I was working with them and kind of making sure they were roughly in line with what I had in mind, but I wanted them to make the decisions and the actual cuts. And this exact tree actually has some pretty significant mistakes in it, but that's hopefully going to become part of the tree's character. Oh boy, it's hard to see behind this, but there's actually a very skinny lifeline right here. And that was not the original plan, but there was a slip up with a tool, and what started as a tiny sharding the other direction pulled all the way out, and it revealed a big lifeline, which gave us this really, really skinny lifeline here. So now I'm just going to try to keep this lifeline, which means I have a whole lot of bark to kind of remove. Right, yeah, this area right here, which is what I'm kind of carving on right now.
How do you sharpen that tool? Does it ever break?
You know, they definitely break. I'll say all carving tools in general are more likely to break than any other bonsai tools, because it's really tempting to use them in ways they weren't designed to be used. And I'll show you a couple examples of that. In terms of how to sharpen them, I find that you actually don't need to do a ton of sharpening on them. But the basics are, these hoop tools, for instance, have, you can kind of see those bevels right there. How do I get this to where it'll focus right on me? There we go. Where there's kind of bevel on this side and on the other side. And you can just use your stone to just go right along those edges like that. And just a little bit of deburring is all you need to do. I actually don't spend much time sharpening these in a given year, because they tend to stay pretty sharp if you're using it on fresh wood. If you're using it on dead wood, you'll find they get dull really quickly, and then you'll be teaching yourself how to sharpen these. And so is this roughly in line with what you all were hoping for tonight? Because if not, we still have time to cover some kind of different aspects of deadwood carving.
With your marking pen, would you show some of the design you're going to do in the future?
Oh, yeah, good question. Let me see here. On this tree?
That's fine.
All right, let me see here.
And
Trying to
Jonas,
get rid of some of the-
you have really made it so we can see your lighting, and your background is really good. You've got this down. I mean, it's been it's like we're right in the tree working with you. It's really nice how you've laid this out. I've enjoyed it.
Good.
Absolutely.
I was going to ask about that. I've done this oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that you have exceeded my expectations for this, showing the slow process and how you come back to it over time and all that. That's been really helpful.
Oh, good. I'm very happy to hear that. I've done this demonstration live before, but one thing I've found about the virtual presentations are there's no such thing as sitting in the back of the room. And so often in a case like this, it's much, much easier to see on the computer screen with a zoomed in camera than it is when you're doing it live, where you can see up close really well at the break, but it's hard during the presentation. And so unless someone's working on really large material, and even this is a little bit on the small side to make it a little bit hard to see, I think that's what makes it the most compelling, is that we can get really close up. So
the hard part,
go ahead.
The hard part about this is that in looking at this and thinking, I've got a tree I could work on like that, but I can't do it until tomorrow.
Oh, sleep getting in the way, but I do recommend being fresh when you use sharp tools. I highly recommend that. So I'm looking at I'm kind of looking at the roots and the bottom of the trunk to see where my best options are for continued lifeline deadwood. And so by far the most important feature of the tree, I don't know how well you can see it, is almost this whirlpool loop the loop in this section. And I want to eventually hollow out the middle. Right now the middle's all filled in. And so the goal is actually to hollow this out so that we have 1 or 2 lifelines on the outside of this whole thing. And then we can see it going around. And so here's what it looks like kind of from the side. It's hard to get the light in there. There we go. Where I want to carve out everything in this area so we can actually open up an air gap. And then instead of looking like a big blob, we're going to be able to highlight that. And so in terms of what I'd mark out, I'd really just be exaggerating the sharis and shrinking down the lifelines in these areas. No real change in design. This is kind of the biggest point that I want to change, is throughout this whole area, so that when we look from one side or the other, let's see if I can get this out of the way, that right through here, there actually should be a hole right there that you see through. I know that's not the part that's in focus. Come on, camera. This is the part where we want to kind of poke a hole through there. And so I'll probably use some power tools for that, but I'll definitely want to clear out and make this as dramatic as possible, because this is the unique feature of the tree in that area. And that's why I didn't want to use this as the primary carving demo, just because I know it's hard to see kind of the interesting parts. And then, you know, with this as a front, we get a great curve at the base. It comes back around, comes toward the viewer and around, and then we can kind of see right through the middle right there. In terms of the top of the tree, it actually doesn't need to be that big. I'm guessing that the top of the tree is only going to be pretty much at the very tallest in this area. And so as big as this tree is, the pot's about 13 inches across. The tree is only going to be about 12, 13 inches tall when all is said and done. So it's a fairly modest, medium-sized tree that'll end up being in a probably 1 inch to 2 inch deep pot, maybe either a round or an oval pot, something like that. But it's going to end up being a pretty small tree. I've just been growing these out so I have things I can take from cutting, and then I'm keeping a few small branches like these that I'll use to actually style the tree. This is kind of the size branch I look for when styling juniper. At the very base, it's almost as thick as a pencil, but that gives us great opportunities for bending. We can kind of put that branch wherever we want it. Whereas I'm keeping these other things alive just so it puts on more wood, grows more roots. So the next repotting, I get a shallower pot, and then I can cut back to to do some actual styling. And so I worked on these trees with one of my teachers who's in Japan, Daisaku Nomoto. And when he comes, he would love to have material like this. And he's like, oh yeah, we'll just make a many multi-year project out of this. And he said, you'll end up with some fantastic trees, but it won't be demo the whole thing. And so we'll wire 3-4 branches, do some carving, and then put it on the shelf for a year, and then repeat. And so it's been really fun so far. This is about as far along as I've got. And I didn't get to it this winter. I wanted to do more carving and wiring. I didn't get to it. So theoretically, maybe this summer I'll make some time for it. That's a good time to catch up on juniper, where I actually bend a few of these branches and start to make it look like a bonsai.
Are you going to twist any of those branches?
So the branches themselves, interestingly, the conventions for styling junipers are that we have relatively quiet branches on really twisty trunks. And so I will likely, if I have a dramatic low branch, if I keep one of these, it might be fun to put some twists in it, which if the branch were to get big enough, you could then put a spiraling shari on it. But that's typically only done on accent branches. And that's actually a really good point that it brings up, is the way we demonstrate age on foliage pads for junipers is when we see kind of the underside of the branch pads have those kind of fingers where the primary branch divides into secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quintenary, however many branches they divide into. And we end up having these branch pads with the kind of fingers along the sides and then the green foliage up on top, whether it's heavy or thin. This is what gives us age, and it makes it look like the bonsai has been in training a really long time. And the support for all of that structure, the primary branch, it's not incredibly important that it has that twist, but it is important that it has at least some interesting movement up, down, and left and right.
Okay.
While kind of being at a downward angle. Any other Deadwood related quandaries with your own trees, or something I might be able to run and grab and show you?
I was just wondering, you were mentioning the ultimate height of that tree and that you have quite a bit of growth above that. Would you air layer that? Or does that?
No, because these are two, so some of these I'll use for cuttings, but these branches are already too big for me. If I air layered it, I wouldn't be able to put compelling twists in it. And so I'm actually really picky. My starting points for junipers are really thin branches like this. And if I took branches like this is small enough to use to style this tree, but if I had excess ones, I would either make a large cutting out of it, or I might style it on the tree, wire it, and then air layer it off already wired. And I actually just brought home almost maybe half dozen trees covered with long skinny shoots just so I can do that exact project. So the jury's out on if that's the most effective way to take advantage of that material, but the trunks are boring. And so I'm just going to try to make these crazy Medusa air layer projects. I will definitely let you know in a post if that works at all. I'm going to guess that's about 2 years out. This year to wire it, put the crazy twist on it, then let it grow for a year, thickening up maybe for 1 more year, and then do the air layers. So 2 to 3 years, I'll know if that was a good or a bad idea.
Jonas, question.
Yeah.
How old are the seedlings that you start with when you first put the curves in them?
I'm doing that right now. Let me grab one to show you. I have a couple right here. I've almost finished my repotting for the year, but the one thing I haven't finished for all of my young junipers. And so what I tend to do is work with trees that are kind of like this. So this is kind of nice in that it's fairly long. It's maybe 10, 11 inches long, but it's small enough that it's really flexible. I can tie this in knots. I can spell my name in cursive. I can do all kinds of things with these branches. And so when they're skinny like this, I can put really crazy twists in them, kind of like this. Cut some of these branches off so you can see it a little better. And so I know it's hard to see, but this little tree was probably that same height. There are probably 3 full revolutions just in the bottom 2-3 inches of the trunk right here. And the idea is that I let this grow for a couple of years, and then I take the next extension and then I wire that up, and maybe I twist it in the opposite direction. And so what I'm doing is kind of creating I know it's hard to see, and that's why I don't post a lot about these, because you can't see anything. And so what you do is you twist up the branches, you keep all of these, and then eventually you wire all of these branches, and these become gin. And so if the owner or grower of these trees had put this level of twist in it, you'd have insane movement and really crazy shapes. I'd expect to start making deadwood on this maybe in 2 to 3 years from now. We'll see how fast it grows, but something like that. If you start with a thicker trunk, you might end up with a tree that looks like this. It might look impressive and have bonsai-like features, but the reality is, because the trunk was so much thicker, I couldn't get as tight a bend in it, and I couldn't get as many curves in it. Now, I could have made it a lot bendier than this, but I was thinking for this tree, maybe I want the trunk to be a lot thicker. If it were maybe 2 inches thick, that would be an appropriate style bend for the top of the tree. And this, even though it started out as maybe 14 inches long, this will still only be a shohin at about 7 inches tall when it's all done. So that's kind of what I'm doing, is turning these kind of fuzzy things into these kind of fuzzy things. And that's the repot I'm doing at the same time. What I typically do is take it out of the pot, wire it, bend it to the point where it's literally splitting and breaking. It usually lives, so I don't worry about that. And then I put it in a slightly bigger pot at a different angle. These are rooted cuttings that are maybe 4 years ago. I took cuttings and have just been neglecting them since then. And so They're perfect for either root grafting or making into little junipers.
That's
Does
neat.
does that address the question a little bit?
I think
Yes,
it's
great.
neat.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can
Oh,
you
cool.
can you talk a little bit how you start your cuttings?
Yeah. The way I do it, I mean, junipers root pretty easily typically. You just make a cut. This is a really safe size of a cutting to make, about this big. You can actually do much bigger cuttings, but if you're playing it safe, you can do a cutting about this big, dip it in root hormone and stick it in some planting medium. It could be bonsai soil, it could be 100% perlite. Doesn't really matter what you use as long as there's good air in there. You don't want it to stay too wet. You don't want pure sand. You mist it, you don't water it a lot, and then over time it'll start growing. And I don't know that this is true from experience, but what I've read and heard from folks is that the best time of year to actually make juniper cuttings is in January. I've made them at all times of the year, and I find that if at the wrong times of year, they root fairly slowly. Another tip I'll give you is, I know one way they do them in Japan is you use a liquid root hormone, make much bigger cuttings. Maybe this whole thing would be the cutting. Soak it in root hormone overnight for maybe 2, 4, 8 hours, maybe 12 hours or 24 hours. Plant it after that big soak, and that will help it grow. Now, here's one tip that I just wasted my time on when making cuttings for these things. I was always worried about making very clean cuts at the bottom of the cutting and dipping that clean cut in root hormone so the tree could absorb the hormone. No juniper ever roots out of the cut site, at least very, very rarely. Where junipers produce roots is at the little tiny bumps, these little nodules right along the branches. I'll kind of zoom in on some of those up there. So these little bumps along here, those actually roots grow directly out of those bumps. So I no longer worry about making clean cuts. I no longer worry about dipping root hormone on the ends. Either don't skip the hormone or soak it so that this area or the whole branch can get it. But it's whenever you see little bumps on branches, that's where the roots are going to emerge. And so that's just something that I've learned from unnecessarily doing too much work for many, many years. I usually leave them under a bench. You can put them in a greenhouse. That would work the best. I wouldn't put them in full sun, maybe a little bit of morning sun or filtered light, but I typically just make a bunch of cuts, keep them short, pull off some of the foliage, root hormone for some amount of time, throw them under the bench and forget about them for a year. Except another mistake I made, don't do what I didn't forget about them. Mine all ended up with juniper scale, which made it a lot harder for them to root. And so if you jam pack them in too tight into the pot, you're way more likely to deal with insects like juniper scale. So I don't recommend that.
Great, thank you.
That was really good.
Mm-hmm.
Very informative, Jonas.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks.
Yes, thank you. This has been
Excellent.
good.
Very, very
If you
good.
want to see, I was going to say, if you want to see kind of a before and after picture, for those of you that have my book, The Little Book of Bonsai, there is the one mini how-to demo section, and Daisaku Nomoto is the one that did the work on that. It's somewhere in the middle of the book, and it shows taking a young juniper, picking a front, pruning it, doing the deadwood work, and then styling it. And it kind of shows how it's the demo version of the work we looked at today, where the planning and the execution was the rough draft of the deadwood work. And I actually have to go back and work on that exact tree now to add kind of a second level of deadwood, where I make more tight spirals along the full length of the trunk. And I start making, instead of just smooth blank pieces of deadwood, I want to start carving fissures into it and start bringing out the character of it, what it can become.
I
It's
have
only
your
got
book.
Oh, go ahead.
I have your book, Jonas. So do you know what page? I was trying to look through where
Man, I have no idea what the page numbers are. I'd have to flip through.
Okay.
But it's this section on, it's kind of a before and after demo. Chapter 5 is popping into my head. I have no idea.
Okay.
It's a very brief section. It's just 2 pages with about 7 or 8 photos that kind of show that progress. But it's a good example of what the overview can be of that fun stage where you start to take the trunk and turn it into a little tree.
Great. And I enjoy your book.
Oh, thank
Yes,
you.
me too. Well, thank you, Jonah.
You're wonderful. It's very easy to listen to you and learn.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. What I was going to say is I have written a couple articles on carving on the website. Actually, this tree might be one of the examples where I had some students tell me what their top tips were for people getting started with carving. And so if you just search for carving on Bonsai Tonight, you'll be able to find those posts. And if a question comes up after the fact, just feel free to send me a note and I'll be happy to help out.
Excellent. And we've recorded this, so it'll also, his presentation will be on the website as well in a few days. So
cool.
Appreciate Jonas. Any other questions or anything?
Just appreciation, lots of appreciation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonas.
You're so
Thanks
easy
so
to
much.
listen
It's
to.
really good to see and hear from you all tonight. It's fun presenting to groups like yours where I actually get to see you all. Actually, to be fair, I'm looking over there at the computer, but it is really good to see your faces. I'm glad to see you all today. It does my heart good.
I like that too.
Ours
Thank
too.
you, Jonas.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.